The words still echo in my mind sometimes, especially on quiet nights when the world falls away and memories wash over me like a midnight tide. No one will ever love you? 4 years ago, those words cut deeper than any knife ever could. They were delivered with such casual cruelty, such absolute conviction, that for a long time I believed them to be true. When someone who once claimed to love you looks you in the eye and declares you fundamentally unlovable, something breaks inside you. A hairline fracture that runs through your soul. But here's the beautiful irony that I savor like fine wine. As I write this, my true love sleeps peacefully in our bed, just a room away. The gold band on my finger catches the light from my desk lamp, a constant, tangible reminder that Bennett was wrong. So spectacularly, catastrophically wrong. They say living well is the best revenge. I disagree. The best revenge is when your ex's prophecy of your eternal loneliness crumbles while he watches from the sidelines, powerless to stop your happiness or claim any credit for the person you've become. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand how it all unraveled before you can appreciate how beautifully it came back together. How one cruel sentence became both my deepest wound and my greatest motivation. So let me take you back to when my world collapsed, when Bennett Harrington looked at me with those empty gray eyes and told me I would always be alone. We'd been together for 3 years. Looking back, there were warning signs from the beginning, but love has a way of washing everything in a rosy glow that obscures the red flags flapping violently in the wind. I met Bennett at a publishing industry mixer in Manhattan. I was 26, working as an editorial assistant at HarperCollins, surviving on instant ramen and ambition. He was 32, already a rising literary agent with a corner office at Sterling & Burke, commanding the room with his confidence and sharp wit. I remember exactly what I was wearing, a second-hand black dress that I'd splurged on from a consignment shop, paired with my only decent heels. My roommate Zoe had insisted on doing my makeup, giving me smoky eyes that made me feel sophisticated and slightly dangerous. "You need to network," she'd said, applying another coat of mascara with surgical precision. "Get your manuscript in front of the right people." My novel, a contemporary coming-of-age story I'd been working on for 4 years, sat completed on my laptop, polished but unpublished. I'd been rejected by 17 agents already. Each form letter had chipped away at my confidence, but I kept revising, kept believing. The mixer was held at an upscale bar in Chelsea, all exposed brick and Edison bulbs, trying very hard to look like it wasn't trying at all. I nursed a gin and tonic I couldn't afford, hovering near a tall table, gathering courage to approach a well-known agent from Waxman Literary. That's when Bennett appeared at my elbow, his cologne subtle but expensive, his smile revealing perfect teeth that I would later learn had been methodically straightened through years of orthodontics his parents had sacrificed to afford. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," he said, his voice carrying that distinctive Connecticut lilt that screams private education and summer homes. I laughed, surprised by his directness. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to a fellow introvert who's learned to play extrovert." He extended his hand. Bennett Harrington, Sterling & Burke. His handshake was firm, confident without being aggressive. His eyes held mine a beat longer than necessary. "Olivia Caldwell," I replied. "HarperCollins, assistant to Meredith Klein." "Ah, fiction department. Meredith's brilliant." He took a sip of his whiskey. "But you're not just an assistant, are you? You have that look." "What look?" "The I have a manuscript in my drawer look." His smile was knowing, a little teasing. "Every assistant editor does." I felt myself blush. "Is my creative desperation that transparent?" "It's not desperation that I see," he said, leaning in slightly. "It's hunger. There's a difference." That night we talked for 3 hours. About books we loved, authors we admired, the changing landscape of publishing. He was knowledgeable without being condescending, charming without seeming practiced. When he asked for my number, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Our first date was at a small Italian restaurant in the West Village, the kind of authentic place tourists never find. He ordered in perfect Italian, recommended a wine that paired beautifully with my pasta, and listened, really listened, when I talked about my novel. "Send it to me," he said over tiramisu. "Not professionally, Sterling doesn't represent your genre, but I'd like to read it. As ... a friend." The way he hesitated before friend made my heart flutter. By the end of the night, when he kissed me outside my apartment building, I was already falling. 3 weeks later, he told me he loved my manuscript. 3 months later, he told me he loved me. A year later, I moved into his Gramercy Park apartment with its doorman and rooftop access. My IKEA furniture looked absurd next to his restoration hardware pieces, but he simply hired a designer who integrated everything seamlessly, creating a space that felt like ours, not just his. "Your taste matters," he insisted when I protested the expense. "This is your home now." That was Bennett, generous, thoughtful, attentive to details. He remembered my coffee order, my favorite flowers, ranunculus, the names of all my college friends. He sent care packages when I had deadlines, left notes in my coat pockets, planned weekend getaways when I was stressed. He also read every revision of my novel, offering insights that genuinely improved it. When I finally signed with an agent, not from his agency but through a connection he'd introduced me to, he threw a surprise party at our apartment, inviting everyone who mattered in my life. "You're going to be a star," he told me that night, his arm around my waist as we stood on our rooftop, the Manhattan skyline glittering around us. I knew it from that first night. I believed him. I believed in us. In the fairy tale we seem to be living. But relationships aren't fairy tales. They're intricate machines with countless moving parts, and ours had fundamental flaws that I chose not to see. The control was subtle at first, suggestions about my wardrobe that gradually became expectations, offhand comments about my friends that slowly limited who I spent time with, the way he would interrogate me about male colleagues, his jealousy masked as protective concern. "I just want you to be taken seriously," he'd say when critiquing my outfit for a work event. "The publishing industry is still so image-conscious." Or, "I'm not saying Zoe is a bad friend, just that she seems to bring out your more impulsive side, and you've been working so hard on your discipline." These comments always came wrapped in concern, delivered with a kiss on the forehead or a squeeze of my hand. And because I loved him, because I thought his success and connections gave him insight I lacked, I listened, I adjusted. I gradually became the version of myself that fit most neatly into his life. The sex was another barometer I ignored. In the beginning, it had been passionate, playful, equal. But over time, it became increasingly about his pleasure, his fantasies. When I tried to express my needs, he would seem enthusiastic momentarily, then subtly redirect. If I persisted, he would sigh and say, "I thought we were connecting, but if you want to turn this into a performance review," and I would backtrack, apologize, settle for less. Friends tried to warn me. Zoe, especially, became increasingly direct. "You're disappearing, Liv," she said during one of our increasingly rare coffee dates. "When was the last time you wore bright colors?" Or laughed without checking his reaction first. "That's not fair," I defended. "Bennett appreciates sophistication, that's all. And I'm not checking his reaction. I just value his opinion. There's a difference between valuing someone's opinion and needing their approval to breathe," she countered. "You used to have your own orbit. Now you're just a moon circling his planet." I ended the coffee date early, angry at her assessment. But her words lingered, joining other doubts I'd been suppressing. The way Bennett would subtly undermine my accomplishments by attributing them to connections he'd provided. How he would praise me in public but criticize me in private. The fact that my novel, now in the final stages before publication, was becoming a source of tension rather than celebration. "I just think the ending could be stronger," he said one night after my editor had already approved the final manuscript. "It feels a bit conventional. Readers expect more sophistication these days." "My editor loves it," I said, a rare moment of standing my ground, "and it's the ending I've always envisioned." He sipped his wine, his expression softening into something like pity. "Of course. And Meredith is very commercial in her tastes. The book will probably do fine. I just thought you aspired to more than fine." That night I stared at the ceiling, wondering when his constructive feedback had started to feel like a slow-acting poison. But the next morning he brought me coffee in bed and tickets to a play I'd been wanting to see, and the moment passed, until it couldn't pass anymore, until the truth became impossible to ignore. It was a Tuesday afternoon, unseasonably warm for April. I'd taken a half-day off work to prepare for an interview with a literary blog, my first press for the novel, which would be published in 3 months. Bennett was supposed to be at a conference in Boston until Thursday. I came home early, planning to rehearse my talking points and try on different outfits. When the elevator opened directly into our apartment, a luxury feature Bennett had particularly loved, I heard music playing. Leonard Cohen, Bennett's favorite for what he called contemplative moods. Confused, I set down my bag. "Bennett? Are you home?" No answer, but the music continued. I walked through the living room toward our bedroom, calling his name again. The door was partially closed, unusual for our apartment, where Bennett preferred an open-concept aesthetic. I pushed it open. Time fractures in moments like these. Your brain can't process what your eyes are seeing, so everything breaks into disconnected fragments. Bennett's naked back, his distinctive constellation of freckles across his shoulders that I used to trace with my fingertips. Dark hair splayed across our pillowcase, not mine, much longer than mine. The rhythmic movement of his body. A woman's manicured hands gripping his back, nails digging into his skin. Her voice breathless. Yes, right there, don't stop. I made a sound. Not quite a gasp, not quite a word. Bennett turned his head, our eyes locked, and in that moment, before shock or guilt could register on his face, I saw something worse. Annoyance. Irritation at the interruption. The woman beneath him, who I now recognized as Adrienne Phillips, a publisher from Penguin Random House, looked over his shoulder, her expression morphing from pleasure to mortification. Olivia, Bennett started, but I was already backing away, my body moving on autopilot while my mind struggled to catch up. I made it to the elevator, jabbing the button repeatedly as if that would make it arrive faster. Behind me, I heard Bennett cursing, the rustle of clothing being hastily donned. Olivia, wait. It's not. The elevator doors opened and I stumbled inside, pressing the lobby button. As the doors began to close, Bennett, wearing only hastily buttoned pants, reached the elevator, holding the doors open with one hand. Don't leave like this, he said, his voice controlled despite the situation. Always controlled. Let me explain. Explain what? My voice sounded foreign to my own ears. How you're fucking Adrienne Phillips in our bed while you're supposed to be in Boston. Keep your voice down, he hissed, glancing back toward the apartment. This isn't like you. That phrase, this isn't like you, had been a frequent refrain throughout our relationship. Whenever I expressed anger, disappointment, or any emotion that inconvenienced him, Bennett would use those words to make me doubt my own reactions. But standing in that elevator, watching him try to manage my response to his betrayal, something hardened inside me. You don't get to tell me what I'm like anymore, I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. We're done. I pushed his arm away from the elevator door. For a moment he resisted, his fingers gripping the metal edge. Then, perhaps remembering his state of undress or concerned about Adrienne overhearing, he stepped back. Fine. Go cool off. We'll talk when you're rational. The doors closed on his face and the elevator descended. In the mirrored walls I caught my reflection, pale, shocked, but strangely calm. The kind of calm that comes when your deepest suspicions are finally confirmed. Because that was the truth I hadn't wanted to admit. Some part of me had been waiting for this moment. Waiting for proof that the fractures I'd felt in our relationship weren't just my imagination or insecurity, but real breaks in what I thought we'd built together. In the lobby, I nodded mechanically at the doorman and walked out into the April sunshine, its brightness now seeming obscene. I walked without direction, my mind racing through calculations, how much of my life was entangled with Bennett's, what extricating myself would require, where I could go tonight. My phone buzzed repeatedly in my bag. I ignored it, walking until I found myself in Washington Square Park. I sat on a bench watching students sprawled on the grass, tourists taking photos, a man playing saxophone near the arch, normal life continuing while mine imploded. Finally, I checked my phone. 6 missed calls from Bennett. 3 text messages. Come home so we can discuss this like adults. You're overreacting. It was a mistake, not the end of the world. I'm worried about you. At least tell me where you are. No apology. No acknowledgement of the pain he'd caused. Just impatience with my reaction and an attempt to position himself as the concerned partner. I called Zoe. I need a place to stay, I said when she answered, my voice finally breaking. Bennett cheated. I found them together. Zoe didn't hesitate. Come over. I'm working from home today. I'll order food, open wine, and prepare the couch. Thank you, I whispered, tears finally coming. I'll be there in 20. Do you want me to stay on the phone while you get a cab? No, I need to do something first. After hanging up, I blocked Bennett's number, then opened my email. He'd sent 4 messages already, each more patronizing than the last. The most recent one read, Olivia, this silent treatment is beneath you. I've asked Adrienne to leave, and I think you and I both know this reaction is more about your insecurities than what actually happened. Come home and let's handle this maturely. I felt a surge of rage so pure it momentarily dried my tears. With shaking fingers, I composed a response. Bennett, I'm sending movers for my things tomorrow between 2 and 4 p.m. Please ensure you're not there. Anything of mine they don't take can be donated. Do not contact me again. Any necessary communication can go through Zoe. Olivia, I hit send, then immediately created a filter to send any future emails from him directly to a folder I wouldn't have to see. Then I hailed a cab to Zoe's apartment in Astoria. That night, curled on Zoe's couch with a blanket wrapped around me like armor, I cried until I was empty. Zoe sat beside me, replenishing my tissues, refreshing my wine, and reminding me that I would survive this. You're better off without him, she said, stroking my hair like my mother used to when I was sick as a child. I know it doesn't feel that way now, but you are. I gave him 3 years. I whispered. I changed myself for him. Then this is your chance to remember who you really are, she replied. The Olivia I met in college. The one who wore bright colors and laughed too loudly and didn't care what anyone thought. I tried to picture that version of myself, but she felt like a stranger, a carefree girl I'd left behind somewhere along the road to becoming Bennett's perfect partner. My book comes out in 3 months, I said, the realization hitting me anew. He knows everyone in publishing. What if he tries to sabotage it? Zoe's expression hardened. He wouldn't dare. And if he tries, we'll fight back. But we both knew Bennett's influence in the industry. His casual remarks could shape opinions, his whispered comments could damage reputations. I had built my own network over the years, but his was older, more established. I just need to get through until the publication, I said, trying to convince myself. Then it won't matter what he says. Zoe squeezed my hand but didn't contradict me. We both knew it wasn't that simple. The next morning, I woke on her couch, momentarily disoriented before the memories crashed back. I checked my phone out of habit, then remembered I'd blocked Bennett. Still, there was an email notification from my agent, Kim. Olivia, Bennett called me this morning. He said you two had a misunderstanding, and he's concerned about your emotional state affecting the launch. Want to tell me what's going on? Coffee at noon? Double K. My hands shook with a fresh surge of anger. Not even 24 hours, and he was already working to control the narrative, positioning me as emotionally unstable. Yes to coffee, I replied. And it wasn't a misunderstanding. I caught him in bed with Adrienne Phillips. I've ended the relationship. I added Adrienne's name deliberately. Kim would understand the professional implications. Adrienne could potentially be a valuable connection for my career, now rendered uncomfortable at best, impossible at worst. I spent the morning making lists with Zoe's help. Items the movers should prioritize, accounts where Bennett and I were linked, people I needed to notify about the breakup before he could spin his version of events. By the time I met Kim at our usual coffee shop near her office, I felt marginally more in control. Kim was already waiting, her iPad on the table and a concerned expression on her face. In her 50s, with silver-streaked black hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, she'd been in publishing long enough to have seen every variety of professional and personal drama. Adrienne Phillips, she said as I sat down skipping pleasantries. Bold choice on his part. Messy. You knew her? I asked, accepting the latte she'd already ordered for me. Everyone knows Adrienne. Brilliant editor, terrible personal boundaries. Kim studied my face. You look like hell, which is appropriate. How are you really doing? I'm staying at Zoe's. Movers are getting my things today. I searched for the right word. Hollowed out. Kim nodded. That's the shock. Soon you'll feel everything at once, which is worse but more productive. She tapped her iPad. Now, professional implications. Bennett has already started damage control, positioning this as a mutual decision complicated by your creative temperament, his words. Of course he has, I said bitterly. I've already reached out to your publicist to ensure we're aligned. The official line is, Olivia and Bennett have amicably parted ways and both wish each other continued success. Boring, dignified, and gives him no openings. I felt a rush of gratitude for Kim's efficiency. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Bennett wields significant influence, and he's not used to losing control of situations, or people. She leaned forward. Your book is excellent, Olivia. It's going to succeed regardless, but the path might be rockier now. I can handle rocky, I said, with more confidence than I felt. I just need to focus on the launch. Kim smiled, a rare full smile that transformed her usually serious face. That's the spirit. Channel everything into your work. It's the best revenge. Later that afternoon, as I sat in Zoe's apartment tracking the mover's progress via text updates, I received a message from an unknown number. It's Bennett. I'm at the apartment watching strangers pack your life into boxes. Is this really how we end? 3 years discarded without a conversation? Call me, please. I stared at the message, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Part of me, the part still in shock, wanted to respond, to hear his explanation, to understand how someone who claimed to love me could betray me so completely. But another part, a stronger part that grew more certain by the hour, recognized this message for what it was: another attempt at control. He wasn't used to having decisions made without his input, to having consequences imposed rather than negotiated. I blocked the new number without responding and returned to my task of listing items the movers might miss. The small watercolor I'd hung in the bathroom that Bennett had always disliked, my grandmother's recipe box in the back of the pantry, the emergency sweater I kept in the hall closet. That evening, Zoe and I ordered takeout and sorted through the first wave of items the movers had delivered to her apartment. Most of my furniture would go into storage, but my clothes, books, and personal items now occupied precarious stacks against her living room wall. "You can stay as long as you need," Zoe said, surveying the chaos. "But maybe we should look for a short-term sublet. Give you some space to regroup?" She was right. Her one-bedroom apartment was already cramped with just her things. With mine added, it was almost unnavigable. "I'll start looking tomorrow," I promised. "And I'll pay extra rent for this month." "Don't insult me," she replied, handing me a spring roll. "Just buy the wine until you move out." We ate in companionable silence, occasionally commenting on items as we unpacked them. A coffee mug from a vacation, a dress I'd forgotten I owned, books with dog-eared pages marking favorite passages. It was while unpacking these books that I found it, a small velvet box tucked between my copies of White Teeth and The Goldfinch. My heart stuttered as I opened it, revealing a diamond ring nestled in silk. "Is that—" Zoe began, eyes wide. "An engagement ring," I confirmed, my voice hollow. He must have hidden it in my things during the move. The ring was exactly my taste, a vintage-inspired emerald-cut diamond in a platinum setting, elegant without being ostentatious. Of course it was perfect. Bennett had always paid attention to my preferences, using that knowledge alternately as gift and weapon. I snapped the box closed, suddenly unable to look at it. "What kind of mind game is this?" Zoe demanded, taking the box from my trembling hands. "He cheats on you, then plants an engagement ring in your stuff?" "It's a power move," I said, understanding dawning with sickening clarity. "He's saying he was planning to propose, trying to make me doubt my decision to leave." "Manipulative bastard," Zoe muttered. That night I couldn't sleep. The ring box sat on Zoe's kitchen counter like a live grenade, threatening to explode my already fragile emotional state. Around 3 a.m., I finally got up and opened it again, studying the ring in the dim light from the microwave clock. Had he really been planning to propose? Or had he purchased the ring after I left, a calculated tool to win me back? Both possibilities twisted my stomach, but for different reasons. If he'd been planning to propose while simultaneously cheating with Adrian, it revealed a level of emotional compartmentalization that was almost sociopathic. If he'd bought it after, it demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of the damage he'd done, believing a ring could erase the image of him with another woman in our bed. Either way, it confirmed what my heart was finally accepting. Bennett didn't love me. He loved the version of me he had created and controlled. The one who adjusted her behavior to suit his preferences, who sought his approval for every decision, who made herself smaller to fit into the space he allowed her. I took a picture of the ring, then typed out a message to the unknown number I'd blocked earlier. "I found the ring. Whatever you were planning, the answer is no. Don't contact me again." I unblocked the number long enough to send the message, then reblocked it immediately. Then I placed the ring box in a padded envelope, addressed it to Bennett's office, and set it by the door to mail the next morning. It felt like cutting the final thread that connected us. I returned to the couch and finally slept, dreamlessly and deeply, until Zoe's alarm woke me at 7 a.m. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of practical matters. I found a month-to-month sublet in Greenpoint, a tiny studio above a Polish bakery that filled the space with the scent of fresh bread each morning. I notified my bank, credit card companies, and various subscriptions of my new address. I drafted emails to friends and colleagues with the sanitized version of events Kim had suggested. Bennett attempted contact 5 more times, from 5 different numbers. I blocked each one without reading his messages. He sent emails that went straight to my filtered folder. He even tried reaching me through mutual friends, who relayed his claims of regret and requests to talk. I held firm. Each attempt at contact only strengthened my resolve, showing me how accustomed he was to wearing down my boundaries. Professionally, I threw myself into preparations for my book launch. My editor, Meredith, was supportive but candid about the challenges ahead. "Publishing is a small world," she said during our meeting to review the final marketing plan. "People talk, but your book stands on its own merits. Focus on that." I nodded, grateful for her straightforwardness. "Has Bennett said anything to you directly?" Meredith's hesitation told me everything before she even spoke. "He reached out to ask about shifting your publicity schedule, suggesting you might need more time given your emotional situation." My throat tightened. And I told him that your emotional state is not his concern anymore, and that our publicity plans are proceeding as scheduled. She offered a small smile. "I've known Bennett for years, Olivia. I've seen his patterns with women. You're not the first assistant editor he's dated or the first relationship he's sabotaged." Her words were both comforting and painful. Comforting to know I wasn't alone in my experience, painful to realize I'd been part of a pattern I hadn't recognized. "Thank you for telling me," I said, "and for standing your ground with him. Your book is too good to be overshadowed by personal drama." She replied simply, "Now let's review these podcast opportunities." We spent the next hour discussing the publicity schedule, and for brief stretches, I was able to focus entirely on my work, forgetting the hollow ache that had taken up residence in my chest. But nights were harder. In my small sublet, with its unfamiliar shadows and sounds, I would lie awake replaying moments from my relationship with Bennett, now viewed through the lens of betrayal. Casual comments that I now recognized as manipulation, generous gestures that had come with invisible strings, the gradual isolation from friends who saw what I couldn't, and sometimes in my weakest moments I missed him. Not the real Bennett who had cheated and lied, but the Bennett I thought I knew, the one who brought me coffee in bed and left notes in my coat pockets, the one who'd held me after my grandmother's funeral and said all the right things. Grief isn't linear, and grief for a relationship lost to betrayal is particularly chaotic. I would cycle through anger, sadness, relief, and longing sometimes within the span of an hour. 3 weeks after discovering Bennett's infidelity, I reached a turning point. I was meeting Kim for another strategy session at a cafe near my new apartment. As I approached, I saw Bennett standing outside, deep in conversation with my agent. I froze half a block away, my heart racing. He was dressed impeccably as always, in a charcoal suit that I recognized. I'd been with him when he bought it last fall. His hair was perfectly styled, his posture confident. To anyone passing by, he would appear to be the successful, charismatic literary agent I'd fallen for. But I saw something different now. I saw the careful calculation behind his charm, the practiced nature of his gestures. I saw the man who could sleep with another woman in our bed, then call my agent to express concern about my emotional stability. I watched as Kim checked her watch, said something brief to Bennett, and entered the cafe, leaving him on the sidewalk. He stood there for a moment, then hailed a cab and departed without noticing me. When I entered the cafe, Kim was already seated at a corner table, her expression grim. "I'm sorry about that," she said as I sat down. "He ambushed me. Said he was just passing by and saw me entering." "What did he want?" I asked, ordering a triple espresso when the server approached. I needed the strongest possible fortification. "To express concern about your isolation and refusal to communicate. He suggested a joint statement about your breakup to control the narrative." Kim's tone made her opinion of this suggestion clear. "I told him any statements about your personal life would come from you alone, and that his concern, while noted, was unnecessary." I felt a surge of gratitude for Kim's professional boundary setting, followed by anger at Bennett's continued attempts to manage how others perceived our breakup. "Thank you for shutting that down," I said. "Has he been contacting other people in my professional circle?" Kim hesitated, then nodded. "From what I've heard, he's been careful, positioning himself as the concerned ex, worried about your well-being while respecting your need for space. It's subtle but effective. He's trying to make me look unstable," I realized aloud, "setting up a narrative where any professional criticism I might express about him can be dismissed as emotional fallout from the breakup." "Precisely," Kim agreed. "It's a common tactic when someone holds more industry power. Create doubt about the other person's emotional stability, and anything they say can be written off as irrational." I sat back in my chair, a cold clarity washing over me. He's afraid I'll talk about what he did, that I'll damage his reputation. Men like Bennett trade on their image, Kim said. The charming, brilliant agent who champions women writers while dating them selectively. If word got out about how he really treats women in private, it would complicate that image. So what do I do? I asked. I've been taking the high road, but he's still controlling the story. Kim studied me for a moment, then leaned forward. What do you want, Olivia? Not what's easiest or most professional. What do you actually want? The question caught me off guard. For so long, I'd been focused on survival, on getting through each day without falling apart. I hadn't allowed myself to consider what I wanted beyond immediate self-protection. I want my book to succeed, I said finally. I want to build my career without his shadow hanging over me. And I paused, the truth rising to the surface. I want him to lose the power to hurt me. Kim nodded. The first two are straightforward. We keep pushing forward professionally. Let your work speak for itself. The third is trickier. That power exists in your mind as much as in reality. I know, I admitted. I'm working on it. There's another element, Kim added, her expression thoughtful. Something I've observed in 20 years of publishing. The most successful authors, regardless of talent, are the ones who build authentic connections with readers, who bring their full selves to their work and their public persona. I'm not sure I follow. Bennett has been crafting your image since you met him, she explained. The sophisticated, reserved writer who speaks carefully and dresses in neutral tones. The perfect complementary piece to his own image. I flinched at the accuracy of her assessment. But that's not the full you, is it? Kim continued. The writer I met 3 years ago was passionate, occasionally messy, with a distinctive voice and perspective. That's the writer who produced this remarkable book. Bennett always said my enthusiasm was charming but unprofessional, I said quietly. Of course he did, Kim replied with a dry laugh. Your authenticity threatened his control. But that authenticity is your greatest professional asset. Her words resonated deeply, touching something I'd buried during my years with Bennett. My true voice, in writing and in life, had been systematically muted to fit his expectations. So what are you suggesting? I asked. Reclaim your narrative, Kim said simply. Not by countering his whispers with your own, but by being unapologetically yourself. In your readings, your interviews, your social media, show the world the real Olivia Caldwell, not Bennett Harrington's carefully curated ex-girlfriend. It was terrifying and exhilarating to consider. After years of second-guessing my natural instincts, of filtering my thoughts and feelings through the lens of what Bennett would approve, the idea of public authenticity felt both liberating and dangerous. Won't that just confirm his portrayal of me as emotionally volatile? I worried. Only if you act emotionally volatile, Kim countered. Being authentic doesn't mean lacking self-control. It means bringing your full intelligence, humor, and perspective to your professional interactions instead of the watered-down version he preferred. She reached into her bag and pulled out an advance copy of my novel, its cover art still making my heart skip despite everything else happening in my life. This book came from the real you, she said, tapping the cover. The person who exists underneath the layers of adaptation you've developed to please him. That's the person readers will connect with. As I left the cafe, Kim's words echoed in my mind. Reclaim your narrative. Be unapologetically yourself. For 3 years, I'd gradually surrendered pieces of my identity to maintain Bennett's approval, my bright clothing replaced with the neutral tones he preferred. My loud laugh muted to the more sophisticated chuckle he didn't find embarrassing at industry events. My natural conversational style, passionate, occasionally rambling, disciplined into the concise, measured speech patterns he modeled. Walking back to my sublet, I stopped at a vintage clothing store I'd passed daily, but never entered. Inside, on a rack of summer dresses, I found a sundress in vibrant yellow with a pattern of small red flowers. Pre-Bennett, I would have immediately tried it on. During our relationship, I would have admired it but passed by, knowing he found yellow garish and floral patterns predictable. I bought the dress. That evening, I wore it to dinner with Zoe at a new Thai restaurant in my neighborhood. When she saw me, her face lit up with genuine surprise and pleasure. "Look at you!" she exclaimed. "I haven't seen you in color since before him." I smoothed the bright fabric self-consciously. "Too much?" "Not enough," she replied firmly. "Next, we need to get your hair back to how you used to wear it." I touched my carefully straightened shoulder-length bob, another Bennett-approved modification to my naturally wavy hair that had once fallen halfway down my back. "One step at a time," I said, but I made a mental note to cancel my upcoming trim appointment. Over spicy noodles and cold beer, I told Zoe about my encounter with Bennett and my conversation with Kim. She's right, Zoe said immediately. The real you is magnetic. It's what drew me to you in college, what made you stand out in our creative writing classes. He dimmed your light because it made you easier to control, not because there was anything wrong with your brightness. I didn't even realize how much I'd changed, I admitted. It happened so gradually. That's how it works, she said, her voice gentle but firm. Good manipulators don't make big demands all at once. They suggest, they guide, they express preferences until you're reconstructing yourself to please them and thinking it was your idea all along. I took a long sip of my beer, letting her words settle. I'm scared, Zoe. My book comes out in 2 months. The publicity starts in 3 weeks. What if I can't find my real voice again by then? You never lost it, she assured me. It's in your writing. It's in moments when you forget to monitor yourself. It's right there, waiting. That night, I did something I'd been avoiding since the breakup. I opened my filtered email folder and read Bennett's messages. There were 23 of them, evolving in tone from commanding to pleading to accusatory and back again. The first few demanded explanations for my dramatic exit and refusal to discuss our issues like adults. The middle batch expressed concern for my emotional state and offers of professional support during my book launch. The more recent ones had taken on a wounded tone, positioning him as the reasonable party facing my irrational rejection. The most recent had been sent just hours earlier, after his encounter with Kim. Olivia, I saw Kim today and expressed my concerns about your isolation. She seems to think you're doing fine, but I know you better than anyone. This withdrawal isn't like you. The Olivia I know values communication and understanding. I've given you space, respected your need to process what happened. But at some point, mature adults have a conversation. What you saw was a mistake, one moment of weakness during a stressful period. 3 years shouldn't end without at least talking. The ring wasn't manipulation, as you suggested in your text. I bought it 2 months ago. Ask Jerome at Tiffany's if you don't believe me. He'll remember. I was waiting for the right moment. Your book launch is approaching. This should be a time of collaboration and celebration, not division. At least meet me for coffee. Public place, your choice of location. One conversation? You owe yourself that much, even if you think you owe me nothing. Bennett. I stared at the screen, feeling a familiar tightening in my chest, the physical response I'd developed to Bennett's particular brand of emotional manipulation, the careful mix of concern and criticism. The implication that my behavior was abnormal while his was reasonable. The subtle repositioning of his infidelity as one moment of weakness. And that phrase, the Olivia I know, used repeatedly throughout our relationship to remind me of who he thought I should be, or at least who he wanted me to be. But this time, instead of doubt, I felt anger. Clear, clarifying anger that burned through the fog of confusion he'd so carefully cultivated. Without overthinking, I hit reply and wrote, Bennett, you don't know me better than anyone. You never did. You knew the version of me that adapted to your preferences, that modified herself to maintain your approval. That wasn't me. It was a careful construction designed to survive you. What I owe myself is freedom from your manipulation. I've found my voice again, and I won't be using it to continue conversations that diminish me. Do not contact me again. Any further attempts at communication will be documented and shared with our mutual professional contacts if necessary. Olivia, I hit send before I could second-guess myself, then immediately created a new email rule diverting his address to a separate folder I wouldn't need to see. Then I closed my laptop and slept better than I had in weeks. The next morning, I woke with a sense of lightness I hadn't experienced since before finding Bennett with Adrian. For the first time, I felt that I might eventually be okay, not just surviving, but actually healing. I made myself coffee in the tiny kitchenette of my sublet, then sat by the window overlooking the street below. The Polish bakery had been open for hours already, and the neighborhood was fully awake. People walking dogs, heading to the subway, carrying coffee cups from the cafe on the corner. Normal life continuing. My life continuing, without Bennett at the center of it. I opened my laptop and, instead of checking email or social media, opened the document containing the speech I'd been drafting for my book launch. The current version was careful, measured, expressing gratitude to my publisher and reflections on the writing process in the reserved tone Bennett had always encouraged for professional settings. I deleted the entire thing and started fresh. The new draft was conversational, occasionally funny, deeply personal in its discussion of how the novel's themes of identity and belonging reflected my own journey. It included an anecdote from my childhood that Bennett had once called too revealing. When I'd shared it at a dinner party, it had my voice, my real voice, running through every line. When I finished 2 hours later, I read it aloud to myself, hearing the cadence of my natural speech for the first time in years. There were moments when Bennett's imagined criticisms tried to intrude, points where I could almost hear him suggesting a more sophisticated phrase or a less personal revelation. I acknowledged these thoughts, then deliberately set them aside. This was my book, my launch, my voice. Bennett had forfeited any right to influence my self-expression. I sent the draft to Kim with a note, "The real me. What do you think?" Her response came within the hour, "This. Exactly this. I've been waiting 3 years to meet this Olivia again." The 6 weeks leading up to my book publication were transformative. With each small decision, letting my hair grow out, wearing clothes that expressed my actual taste rather than Bennett's preferences, speaking in my natural rhythm during interviews, I reclaimed pieces of myself that had been surrendered during our relationship. The process wasn't linear. There were days when I backslid into doubt, when I caught myself wondering what Bennett would think of a particular outfit or turn of phrase. There were nights when loneliness hit hard, when the habit of reaching for him was still so ingrained that his absence felt like a physical wound. But there were also breakthroughs. The first time I laughed freely during a pre-publication interview, without monitoring my volume or covering my mouth as Bennett had subtly trained me to do. The day I wore bright red lipstick to a meeting with my publisher's marketing team and received genuine compliments instead of the tight smile Bennett would have offered before suggesting something more natural. And there was the growing excitement about my book, the positive early reviews, the enthusiastic response from booksellers who received advance copies, the scheduling of additional events beyond what had originally been planned. People connect with your authenticity. Kim told me during our weekly call, "The version of you that Bennett preferred might have been more polished, but this version is magnetic." I also began making new connections within the industry, genuine relationships not filtered through Bennett's approval or facilitated by his network. I joined a group of debut authors who met monthly to share advice and support. I reconnected with former colleagues from HarperCollins, whom I'd gradually lost touch with during my relationship. Through these new and renewed connections, I began hearing more about Bennett's reputation among women in publishing. The pattern Meredith had hinted at became clearer, his habit of mentoring female assistants and junior editors, transforming those professional relationships into romantic ones, then gradually reshaping them to suit his preferences before eventually discarding them when they became too independent or he found someone new. I wasn't the first. Adrienne wasn't the first affair. The cycle had been repeating for years, protected by the power dynamics of the industry and Bennett's careful impression management. This knowledge was both painful and liberating. Painful to realize how predictable my experience had been, liberating to understand that the fault lay in his pattern, not in my worth. 2 weeks before my book launch, I received an unexpected email from Adrienne Phillips. Seeing her name in my inbox made my stomach clench, but curiosity won out over aversion. "Olivia, I've drafted this email countless times over the past 2 months. There's no adequate apology for what I did. I won't insult you by attempting to excuse my behavior or minimize your pain. What I can offer is context that might help you process what happened, though you have every right to delete this without reading further. Bennett and I had a brief relationship 6 years ago when I was an assistant editor at Penguin. It ended when I discovered he was simultaneously seeing someone else. I cut contact entirely and worked hard to avoid him professionally. 3 months ago, he reached out regarding a manuscript. The communication was strictly professional at first, then evolved to coffee meetings, then lunch. He told me his relationship with you was complicated and effectively over. He said you had grown distant, were pulling away, might be involved with someone else. I believed him because I wanted to believe him. When you walked in that day, the look on your face made it immediately clear that everything he'd told me was a lie. I'm not asking for forgiveness or friendship. I'm writing because I've learned he's been spinning a narrative about your emotional stability, and I wanted you to know that if you ever need someone to counteract those claims with the truth, I'm willing to do so. He should not be able to damage your reputation after causing such pain. Your book, by the way, is extraordinary. I received an advance copy through industry channels and couldn't put it down. Your voice deserves to be heard. Adrienne. I read the email twice, unsure how to feel. There was validation in having Bennett's manipulative pattern confirmed by someone else who had experienced it. There was a complicated gratitude for Adrienne's offer to speak truth if needed. And beneath it all, a lingering hurt that might never fully heal. The image of them together still flashed in my mind at unexpected moments. After careful consideration, I replied, "Adrienne, thank you for your email. While I can't offer forgiveness yet, I appreciate your honesty and your offer of support. Bennett's pattern of behavior is becoming clearer to me, and your perspective adds to that understanding. I'm focusing on my book launch and rebuilding my life. Maybe someday we can have coffee and talk further, but for now, I need to maintain distance. I'm glad you enjoyed the book." Olivia, brief, honest, neither coldly dismissive nor falsely warm. It felt like the right balance, acknowledging her outreach without pretending the hurt didn't exist. The week before my book launch, I made a final break from my old life. I'd been saving aggressively since the breakup, cutting expenses and taking on additional freelance editing work. The sublet above the Polish bakery had served its purpose as a transitional space, but it was time for something more permanent. I found a one-bedroom apartment in Cobble Hill, smaller than the Gramercy Park apartment I'd shared with Bennett, but entirely mine. It had original hardwood floors, tall windows that flooded the space with light, and built-in bookshelves along one wall of the living room. The rent stretched my budget, but with my advance for the second book I'd recently begun writing, it was manageable. The day I signed the lease, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. This was no longer temporary survival. This was rebuilding. Creating a life that was authentically mine, not defined by Bennett's presence or absence. I sent Zoe a picture of the keys with the caption, "New home, new chapter." Her reply made me laugh out loud. "Thank God. I love you, but your shoes have colonized my entire closet." That weekend, Zoe helped me move in, along with two other friends I'd reconnected with since the breakup. We ordered pizza, drank cheap champagne from coffee mugs because I hadn't unpacked glasses yet, and christened the apartment with stories and laughter. As they were leaving, Zoe hung back, pulling a small wrapped package from her bag. "A housewarming gift," she said. "Open it tomorrow when you wake up in your new place." The next morning, I unwrapped Zoe's gift with my first cup of coffee. It was a framed photograph from our college graduation, Zoe and me with our arms around each other, both wearing bright floral dresses under our gowns, laughing unreservedly at something now forgotten. My hair was wild and curly, falling past my shoulders. My smile was wide and unself-conscious. Attached was a note in Zoe's handwriting. She was always there. "Welcome back." I placed the photograph on my bedside table, a daily reminder of who I had been before Bennett and who I was becoming again after him. The night of my book launch arrived with a mixture of anxiety and exhilaration. The event was being held at Books Are Magic in Brooklyn, an independent bookstore known for its supportive community and thoughtful programming. My publisher had initially suggested a Manhattan venue with more industry presence, but I had pushed for something that felt more authentically connected to my current life. I arrived early, wearing a deep blue dress I'd found in a vintage shop, a color Bennett had once said was too intense for my complexion. My hair, now grown out to its natural waves, was pulled back with a few curls framing my face. I felt nervous but centered, present in a way I hadn't been during public events with Bennett. The store's events manager showed me the setup, rows of chairs already filling with attendees, my books displayed prominently on a table near the podium, a small area for the signing afterward. There was something surreal about seeing my name and cover art featured so prominently, about watching strangers enter the space specifically to hear me speak. "We're expecting a full house," the manager told me. "There's been a lot of buzz about your book." I nodded, grateful but also fighting a wave of imposter syndrome. Would these people see through me? Would they be disappointed by the real Olivia after perhaps hearing about the more polished version Bennett had cultivated? Kim arrived, impeccable as always in a tailored pantsuit, carrying a sleek leather portfolio. "Deep breaths," she advised, studying my face. "You've got this. The hardest part is already done. You wrote a brilliant book." "I keep expecting to see him walk in," I admitted quietly. "Is that crazy?" Kim shook her head. "It's normal, but he won't come. He's too careful about his image to risk creating an uncomfortable scene." She was right, of course. Bennett was nothing if not strategic about his public appearances. Still, I found my eyes drifting to the entrance each time the door opened, a Pavlovian response I couldn't quite suppress. Zoe arrived with a group of friends claiming seats in the second row. She gave me a thumbs up and an exaggerated wink that made me laugh despite my nerves. My editor Meredith came with several colleagues from HarperCollins, their presence a tangible reminder of the professional support I still had despite Bennett's influence. By the time the events manager introduced me, the store was packed, every seat filled with additional attendees standing along the walls and between bookshelves. The crowd's energy was palpable, a mixture of curiosity and goodwill that helped steady my racing heart. I approached the podium, set down my notes, and looked out at the sea of faces. For a moment, I felt a familiar hesitation, the ghost of Bennett's coaching about public speaking, his emphasis on appearing poised and measured. Then I saw Zoe's encouraging smile, remembered the photograph by my bedside, and found my voice, my real voice. "Thank you all for coming tonight," I began, and the words flowed naturally from there, warm, occasionally funny, deeply personal without being self-indulgent. I read a passage from the novel, then spoke about the themes of identity and belonging that had shaped the narrative, drawing subtle parallels to my own recent journey without explicitly mentioning Bennett. During the Q&A, someone asked about my writing process. Without overthinking, I shared an anecdote about my early morning writing routine that included my habit of dancing to 80s pop songs before sitting down at my computer, a detail Bennett had once called too quirky to mention in professional settings. The audience laughed appreciatively, and I caught Zoe nodding vigorously from her seat, recognizing this small reclamation of my authentic self. As the formal presentation ended and I moved to the signing table, I felt a curious lightness. I had been fully present as myself, not Bennett's carefully curated version of me, but the real Olivia, with all her enthusiasm, occasional awkwardness, and genuine passion for stories. The signing line was long, each reader bringing their own connection to my book, their own questions and observations. I found myself energized rather than drained by these interactions, genuinely interested in what had resonated with each person. About halfway through the line, I looked up to greet the next reader and felt a jolt of recognition. It was Jerome from Tiffany's, the jeweler Bennett had mentioned in his email about the engagement ring. He was holding my book, smiling somewhat awkwardly. "I hope this isn't inappropriate," he said quietly as he placed the book before me. "I read a review and was intrigued, then recognized your name. Your novel is wonderful." I felt a momentary disorientation, this unexpected collision of my past and present, but then a curious calm. "Thank you, Jerome. It's nice to see you under better circumstances." He nodded, understanding the reference. "I wanted to say, I'm sorry about how things turned out. Mr. Harrington was very specific about the ring design. He said it needed to be perfect for you." The comment could have been painful, a reminder of what might have been. Instead, it highlighted the fundamental contradiction of Bennett, his ability to pay meticulous attention to details while missing the essence of true care and respect. "Some things look perfect on the surface but aren't built to last," I said, signing Jerome's book with a personal note thanking him for coming. "I hope you enjoy the rest of the story?" He nodded, seeming to understand the layers of my response. "I'm already halfway through. You have a distinctive voice, very authentic." As he moved away, I felt a wave of gratitude for this unexpected moment of closure, this small confirmation that Bennett had indeed purchased the ring well before our breakup, planning to propose even while betraying the foundation of trust that proposal would have represented. By the time the last book was signed and the store began to empty, I felt both exhausted and exhilarated. My publisher had arranged a small celebration at a nearby restaurant where champagne and congratulations flowed freely. Surrounded by colleagues, friends, and readers who had stayed to join the party, I found myself truly celebrating not just my book, but my reclaimed sense of self. It was nearly midnight when I finally returned to my new apartment, kicking off my shoes at the door and collapsing onto the couch that Zoe had helped me position perfectly to catch the morning light. My phone buzzed with a text from Kim. "You were magnificent tonight. Completely yourself. This is just the beginning." I smiled, running my fingers along the spine of my own book, my name embossed in silver against the deep blue cover. For so long I had dreamed of this moment, imagining Bennett beside me, his approval validating my achievement. The reality was different but infinitely more valuable. I had reached this milestone on my own terms, with my authentic voice, surrounded by people who appreciated me for who I truly was, rather than who someone else wanted me to be. As I drifted toward sleep, I remembered Bennett's cruel words that had once cut so deeply. "No one will ever love you." In the quiet of my new home, with the afterglow of the launch still warming my spirit, those words had lost their power. Because I had rediscovered something essential. Before anyone else could truly love me, I needed to reclaim and love myself. And that journey, despite its painful catalyst, was well underway. The month following my book launch was a whirlwind of activity. The novel received positive reviews in several major publications, sales were strong for a literary debut, and my publicity schedule expanded to include radio interviews and additional bookstore events throughout the Northeast. Through it all, I maintained the authentic voice I'd reclaimed at my launch, speaking passionately about my work, laughing freely when something amused me, allowing my natural enthusiasm to show rather than containing it in the restrained package Bennett had preferred. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Readers connected with my openness, fellow authors appreciated my candor about the writing process, and industry professionals treated me with a respect that had nothing to do with Bennett's influence. I heard rumors about Bennett's reaction to my success, whispers from mutual acquaintances that he was claiming credit for discovering, me for developing, my voice through his guidance. These stories might have angered me earlier, but now they seemed almost pathetically predictable, a desperate attempt to maintain control over a narrative that had slipped from his grasp. 6 weeks after my launch, I was scheduled to appear at a literary festival in Boston, a significant opportunity to reach new readers and connect with other authors. The night before my departure, as I was packing, my phone lit up with a text from an unknown number. "I'll be at the Boston Festival tomorrow, moderating the Emerging Voices panel. We need to talk before you arrive to ensure things remain professional. Double B." My hands froze over my suitcase, the familiar tightness returning to my chest. Of course Bennett would be there. His agency regularly sent representatives to major literary events. And of course he would be moderating the exact panel I was scheduled to appear on. This wasn't coincidence. This was calculation. For a moment, the old anxiety threatened to overwhelm me, the fear of confrontation, the habitual deference to Bennett's definition of professional, the automatic assumption that I needed to accommodate his comfort rather than protecting my own. I set down my phone without responding and sat on the edge of my bed, focusing on my breathing. This was a test, not one Bennett had consciously designed, but a test nonetheless. Would I revert to old patterns in the face of direct contact? Or would I maintain the boundaries I'd established? After several minutes of deliberate breathing, I picked up my phone and called Kim. "Bennett just texted me," I said when she answered. "He's moderating my panel in Boston tomorrow and wants to talk before I arrive." Kim was silent for a moment, then asked, "What do you want to do?" The question, simple but profound in its positioning of my desires as central, helped clarify my thoughts. "I don't want to meet with him privately," I said firmly. "I don't want to give him any opportunity to manipulate the situation or me." "Good," Kim replied. "I'll contact the festival organizers immediately. Bennett shouldn't have been assigned to your panel given your personal history. That's a basic professional courtesy they've overlooked. I'll request a different moderator." "What if they can't change it?" I asked, the practical concern cutting through my emotional response. "Then you have options," Kim said. "You can withdraw from the panel, which would be completely understandable. Or you can participate with clear boundaries, arrive just before it begins, engage professionally with all panelists including Bennett, and leave immediately after. No private conversations, no opportunities for him to corner you." The fact that withdrawing was presented as a legitimate option, that my emotional well-being was prioritized over professional opportunity, was itself healing. Bennett would have dismissed such concerns as overly sensitive or unprofessional. "Let's try to change the moderator," I decided. "If that's not possible, I'll participate with boundaries. I won't give him the satisfaction of thinking he can scare me away." "That's my girl," Kim said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "I'll handle this tonight and let you know the outcome." After hanging up, I returned to packing with renewed focus. Regardless of what happened with the panel, I would be prepared to face Bennett with dignity and strength if necessary. Kim called back an hour later with news. The festival apologized for the oversight. They're reassigning Bennett to a different panel and bringing in Margot Chen to moderate yours. Relief washed over me. Thank you, Kim. Don't thank me yet, she warned. He'll still be at the festival. Prepare yourself for the possibility of running into him elsewhere. She was right, of course. Boston wasn't large enough to guarantee we wouldn't cross paths. But at least our first encounter wouldn't be in the power-imbalanced setting of him moderating a discussion of my work. I arrived in Boston the next morning feeling both anxious and determined. The festival was being held at the Boston Public Library and various venues throughout the city, with author panels, readings, and signings scheduled throughout the weekend. My panel, Debut Authors, Fresh Voices in Fiction, was scheduled for 2 p.m. I spent the morning attending other sessions, networking with booksellers, and trying not to constantly scan the crowds for Bennett's familiar silhouette. During lunch, I sat with 2 other authors from my panel in the festival's hospitality suite. We were discussing our publishing journeys when I felt a prickle of awareness, that sixth sense you develop about someone's presence after years of attunement to their movements and moods. I didn't need to turn around to know Bennett had entered the room. The subtle shift in energy, the way conversations nearby momentarily paused, then resumed with slightly altered cadences. These were telltale signs of his arrival. Bennett had always had that effect, his confident presence demanding acknowledgement even from those who didn't know him. I continued my conversation, refusing to turn and look, though my heart hammered so loudly I was sure my companions must hear it. I laughed at something one of them said, the sound natural despite my inner turmoil. Olivia. His voice came from just behind me, that distinctive baritone that had once been the soundtrack to my daily life. I took a deliberate breath before turning. Bennett stood there, impeccably dressed as always in a tailored navy suit that I'd never seen before. His hair was slightly different, shorter on the sides than he'd worn it during our relationship. These small changes were jarring, tangible reminders that life had continued for him just as it had for me. Bennett, I acknowledged, keeping my tone neutral, neither coldly dismissive nor warmly familiar. I wasn't expecting to see you until my panel. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. He'd clearly been informed about the moderation change. Plans change, he said smoothly. I heard your book is doing well. Congratulations. Thank you. I gestured to my tablemates. Have you met Elisa Abrams and Theo Washington? We're all on the Fresh Voices panel together. It was a deliberate strategy, maintaining the interaction in public, keeping it professional, denying him the private conversation he'd requested. Bennett recognized the tactic. I could see it in the slight tightening around his eyes, but social conditioning required him to acknowledge my companions. Handshakes and introductions were exchanged. Bennett was charming as always, making a specific reference to each author's work that demonstrated he'd done his homework. I used the opportunity to excuse myself. I need to prepare for the panel, I said, standing. It was nice seeing you, Bennett. I'm sure we'll cross paths again during the festival. I walked away before he could respond, feeling his eyes on my back as I left the hospitality suite. In the hallway, I ducked into a quiet alcove and took several deep breaths, fighting the trembling that threatened to overtake my limbs. This brief interaction, lasting perhaps 2 minutes, had required more emotional strength than I'd anticipated. But I'd maintained my composure, set a clear boundary, and denied Bennett the private audience he'd wanted. It was a small victory but significant. My panel went smoothly. Margot Chen was an excellent moderator, asking thoughtful questions that allowed each author to highlight the unique aspects of their work. When she asked about my creative process, I spoke honestly about the early morning writing sessions, the playlist of 80s music that got me started, the walks through Brooklyn that helped me work through plot problems. From the corner of my eye, I could see Bennett standing at the back of the room, his expression inscrutable. I didn't alter a single word of my responses based on his presence, didn't check his reaction before answering questions from the audience. This, too, was a victory, speaking authentically despite his watchful gaze. After the panel, I signed books and chatted with readers, immersing myself in these genuine connections rather than worrying about Bennett's whereabouts. When the signing ended, I checked my phone and found a text from him. Your panel was excellent. Dinner tonight? We have things to discuss that would benefit us both professionally. 7 p.m. at Soralina? The restaurant he suggested was upscale, quiet, intimate, a setting designed for serious conversation without interruption. The old Olivia might have accepted out of an ingrained sense of obligation, a desire to maintain peace, a fear of appearing unprofessional by refusing. But that Olivia no longer made my decisions. I replied simply, "No thank you. My schedule is full this evening." Then I turned off my phone and headed to a casual dinner with Elisa, Theo, and several other debut authors I'd met during the day. We ate burgers at a pub near the library, sharing publishing stories and marketing strategies, laughing about the absurdities of author life. It was relaxed, supportive, and entirely Bennett-free. When I returned to my hotel and turned my phone back on, there were 3 messages from him. "This childish avoidance isn't like you. We need to establish a professional understanding going forward. The industry is too small for continued awkwardness. I'll be in the hotel bar until 10 p.m. if you reconsider." I deleted all 3 without responding and slept soundly, waking refreshed for my final day at the festival. That morning, as I was leaving my hotel room, the elevator opened to reveal Bennett already inside. For a moment I considered waiting for the next one, but that felt like retreating. Instead I stepped in, nodding politely but not speaking. Bennett waited until the doors closed before saying, "You've ignored my messages." "Yes," I agreed simply. "That seems unnecessarily hostile." I looked at him directly for the first time, studying the face I'd once known better than my own. He appeared tense beneath his carefully maintained expression of reasonableness. "Setting boundaries isn't hostility, Bennett. It's self-care." The elevator stopped at the lobby level. As the doors opened, he placed his hand on my arm, not forcefully, but with enough pressure to request pause. "Olivia, be reasonable. We can't avoid each other forever in this industry. A simple conversation would clear the air." I gently but firmly removed his hand from my arm. "I am being reasonable. I've established the level of contact I'm comfortable with. Professional interactions in public settings are fine. Private meals and conversations are not. Please respect that." I stepped out of the elevator, leaving him standing there. As I walked through the lobby, I felt a curious lightness, the unburdening that comes with standing firm in your own truth. The remainder of the festival passed without further direct interaction with Bennett, though I occasionally spotted him across rooms or in hallways between sessions. Each sighting produced less anxiety than the one before, as if my emotional system was gradually recalibrating to his presence, acknowledging it without being destabilized by it. On my flight back to New York, I reflected on the weekend. Bennett had clearly wanted to establish a narrative of amicable professional connection, to paper over our painful history with a veneer of civilized interaction. This would have served his interests, allowing him to manage how others perceived our breakup and potentially neutralizing any negative impact to his reputation. By refusing this narrative, by maintaining clear boundaries instead, I had prioritized my own healing over his comfort. The Bennett of a year ago would have successfully manipulated me into acquiescence, using my desire to be reasonable and professional as leverage to get what he wanted. But I was no longer that person. In the months that followed, my book continued to exceed expectations, receiving a prominent review in the New York Times and being selected for several best of lists. I began work on my second novel, finding the process both challenging and liberating without Bennett's influence shaping my creative decisions. I dated casually, nothing serious, but enough to reassure myself that I could still feel attraction and connection with others. Each positive interaction helped counter Bennett's cruel prediction that no one would ever love me. Our paths crossed occasionally at industry events. Each time I maintained the same boundaries: professional courtesy in public settings, no private interactions. Eventually, the sightings became less fraught, more like encountering a former colleague than the man who had once occupied the center of my world. Almost a year to the day after discovering Bennett's infidelity, I attended the annual Publishing Industry Awards Gala. My novel had been nominated in the debut fiction category, an honor that, while not expected to result in a win, represented significant recognition. I wore a vintage 1950s gown in emerald green with a dramatic neckline, something Bennett would have considered too attention-seeking for such an event. My hair, now grown back to its natural length and curl, was styled in loose waves. I felt confident, authentic, and entirely myself. During the cocktail hour before the ceremony, I circulated through the ballroom, chatting with colleagues and celebrating other nominees. There was a moment when the crowd shifted and I found myself face to face with Bennett and Adrian Phillips. They weren't touching, maintaining a careful professional distance, but there was an unmistakable intimacy in their body language, the slight lean toward each other, the familiar way they communicated with minimal words. They were clearly together again, or still. Bennett saw me first, his expression flickering with something unreadable before settling into his professional smile. Adrienne noticed me a moment later, her discomfort more visible in the sudden tension of her shoulders. "Olivia," Bennett acknowledged. "Congratulations on your nomination." "Thank you," I replied, my voice steady. "Congratulations to both of you as well." They had been nominated in the Agent-Editor Partnership category for a best-selling thriller they'd collaborated on. An awkward silence threatened to descend, the kind that might once have prompted me to fill it with nervous chatter or a hasty retreat. Instead, I simply maintained eye contact, comfortable in the moment despite its inherent tension. Adrienne spoke first. "Your book was remarkable, Olivia. One of my favorite reads this year." The compliment seemed genuine despite the complicated history between us. I nodded my acknowledgement. "Thank you. The industry seems to be responding well to authentic voices and experiences." Bennett's eyes narrowed slightly, perhaps detecting the subtle implication in my words, that authenticity was something he had discouraged rather than nurtured. "Authenticity has always been valuable," he said smoothly, "when properly channeled and developed." The old Bennett speak, the careful repositioning, the implication that raw authenticity needed his particular guidance to be worthwhile. Once, those words would have made me doubt myself, question whether my success was despite my authenticity rather than because of it. Now they slid off me like water from waxed canvas. "If you'll excuse me," I said with a polite smile. "I see my editor trying to get my attention." As I walked away, I heard Adrian murmur something to Bennett, his response too low to catch. I didn't look back. I didn't win the award that night. It went to a deserving debut with a powerful social justice theme, but the nomination had already expanded my readership and opened doors for my second book. As I gathered my wrap and evening bag at the end of the night, preparing to share a cab uptown with Meredith and another editor from HarperCollins, I felt Bennett's presence before I saw him. He approached alone, his expression serious. "Can I have a moment?" I glanced at Meredith, who raised an eyebrow in silent question. I nodded to indicate I was okay, and she stepped a few feet away, close enough to intervene if needed, far enough to give a semblance of privacy. "What is it, Bennett?" I asked, neither hostile nor welcoming. He seemed to struggle with his words, unusual for someone typically so articulate. "I read your interview in Poets and Writers last month." I nodded, recalling the in-depth profile that had explored my writing process, influences, and journey to publication. It had been candid about how personal relationships impact creative work, though I had never mentioned Bennett by name. "You talked about finding your authentic voice after years of self-censorship," he continued, "about how easy it is to lose yourself in someone else's vision of who you should be." "I did," I acknowledged, wondering where this was leading. Bennett's jaw tightened. "People who know us will read that as a criticism of me. As if I somehow suppressed your true self." So that was it. Concern about his reputation, how others might perceive him based on my honest reflection about my own growth. Typically Bennett, making my personal journey about its impact on him. "People will interpret it however they choose," I said evenly. "I didn't name you. I spoke my truth about my experience." "Your truth paints me as controlling," he countered, his voice low but intense. "Is that really how you see our relationship? Everything I did was to help you succeed." For a moment, I considered the easy path, reassuring him, softening my stance, prioritizing his feelings as I had for 3 years. But that would dishonor the work I'd done to reclaim myself. "Bennett," I said carefully, "how I see our relationship doesn't matter anymore. It's over. We've both moved on." I glanced meaningfully in Adrienne's direction across the room. "What matters is that I'm happy with who I am now. You should focus on your current relationship rather than dissecting our past one." His expression hardened. "You've changed." "Yes," I agreed simply. "That's what growth looks like." Something flashed across his face. Anger, perhaps, or frustration at his inability to draw me into the emotional dynamic he'd expected. For a moment, I glimpsed the real Bennett beneath the polished exterior, a man accustomed to controlling narratives, including those about himself, now confronted with a story he couldn't edit. "I genuinely wanted you to succeed," he said finally, his tone suggesting this should count for something significant. "I know," I replied, and I meant it. "But you wanted me to succeed as the version of me you approved of, not as my authentic self." I glanced toward Meredith, signaling that our conversation was concluding. "I wish you well, Bennett. Truly." As I turned to leave, he said it. The words he'd once used to devastate me, now delivered with quiet bitterness. No one will ever love you like I did. I stopped, turning back to face him one last time. In that moment, seeing his handsome face twisted with wounded pride, I felt an unexpected wave of compassion. Bennett's controlling nature, his need to shape others to fit his vision, these weren't signs of strength but of profound insecurity. "You're right," I said softly. "No one will ever love me like you did. And that's a blessing, not a curse." I walked away, joining Meredith and heading toward the exit. As we stepped into the cool night air, she gave me a sidelong glance. "Everything okay?" I considered the question, taking stock of my emotional state after this final confrontation with Bennett. I felt clear-headed, centered, unburdened by the need for his approval or understanding. "Yes," I said, smiling genuinely. "Everything is exactly as it should be." 1 year later, my second novel was nearing completion. My first had gone into its 6th printing, and I was teaching a writing workshop at NYU one evening a week. My life had found a rhythm that felt authentically mine. Creative, connected, occasionally messy, but fundamentally true to who I was. I rarely thought about Bennett anymore. Our paths still crossed at industry events, but these encounters had lost their emotional charge, becoming merely professional interactions with a former colleague rather than fraught reminders of betrayal. I had dated casually throughout the year, enjoying connections without rushing toward commitment. There had been Daniel, a literature professor with kind eyes and an encyclopedic knowledge of modernist poetry. Sophia, a graphic designer whose creativity and spontaneity had awakened similar qualities in me during our brief but intense relationship. Marcus, a doctor whose demanding schedule had ultimately made continuing difficult despite genuine mutual attraction. Each relationship, however brief, had helped heal the wounds Bennett had left. Not just the betrayal of his infidelity, but the deeper injury of his prediction that no one would ever love me. Each person who saw me clearly and valued me authentically chipped away at that cruel prophecy. It was at my NYU workshop that I met James. He was auditing the class, a successful environmental lawyer with a long-held dream of writing fiction. In his mid-30s, with thoughtful brown eyes and a quiet confidence that never veered into arrogance, he approached writing with both humility and determination. Our connection developed gradually, first through his insightful comments on other students' work, then through questions that lingered after class, eventually evolving into conversations over coffee that extended well beyond discussing his manuscript. James was different from Bennett in fundamental ways. Where Bennett performed charm, James simply was charming, genuinely interested in others, quick to laugh at himself, comfortable with vulnerability. Where Bennett had projected confidence that masked insecurity, James possessed the true confidence that allows for admitting limitations and expressing uncertainty. Most importantly, James loved my authentic self, the loud laugh Bennett had tried to modulate, the passionate tangents he encouraged rather than contained, the bright colors he complimented instead of subtly criticizing. 6 months into our relationship, as we cooked dinner together in my Cobble Hill apartment, him chopping vegetables while I stirred risotto, debating the merits of different narrative perspectives, I realized I was happy. Not the careful, managed happiness I'd convinced myself I had with Bennett, but a deep, authentic joy that came from being fully seen and accepted. "You have that look," James said, pausing his chopping to study my face. "What look?" "The one where you're having a profound thought while stirring risotto," he replied with a smile. "Care to share?" I considered deflecting with humor, an old habit of protection. Instead, I embraced honesty. "I was thinking about how happy I am. With you, with us. It's different from what I thought happiness was supposed to feel like." James set down his knife, gave the risotto a quick stir to prevent sticking, then wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. "Different how?" he asked. "Easier," I said after a moment's reflection. "Not in a boring way, but in a fundamental sense. I don't have to monitor myself or edit my thoughts before speaking. Happiness with you feels like coming home to myself while also being with you." He kissed my temple, a gesture of simple affection that had become wonderfully familiar. "That's how it should feel. Love shouldn't require you to be less of yourself." The word love hung in the air between us, not our first time using it, but significant in this context. James turned me gently to face him, his expression serious but warm. "You know, when we met, you had this armor around you," he said. Not obvious, but I could sense it. Like you were expecting to be judged or found wanting. I nodded, acknowledging the truth of his observation. I was still healing. I know that now, he continued. But what impressed me was how, despite that armor, you were so authentically yourself in your teaching, your writing, your interactions with students. It would have been easier to stay guarded in all aspects of your life, but you chose vulnerability in your work even while protecting your heart. The risotto needed attention, but neither of us moved, held in this moment of recognition. Watching that armor gradually come down with me has been the greatest privilege, James said, tucking a curl behind my ear with gentle fingers. Getting to know the full Olivia, brilliant, occasionally chaotic, unfailingly compassionate, stubbornly principled, has been the adventure of my life so far. Tears pricked my eyes, not from sadness but from the profound relief of being truly seen and cherished rather than evaluated and adjusted. The risotto's going to stick, I said, my voice thick with emotion. James laughed, releasing me with a final kiss, always the practical one in a moment of high emotion. It's one of the many things I love about you. As we resumed cooking, falling into easy conversation about his day in court and my progress on the final chapters of my novel, I thought about Bennett's cruelly delivered prediction, "No one will ever love you." How wrong he had been. James loved me. My friends loved me. My readers connected with my authentic voice. And most importantly, I had learned to love myself, not the curated version Bennett had approved of, but the real Olivia with all her complexities and contradictions. That night, as James slept beside me, I completed the final chapter of my second novel. The story was different from my debut, more assured, more daring in its structure and themes. It contained elements of my journey from Bennett to James, from controlled performance to authentic expression, though transformed through fiction into something universal rather than merely personal. I typed the last sentence, then sat in the quiet of my bedroom, listening to James's peaceful breathing, feeling the satisfaction of work completed honestly and well. On my bedside table, the photograph from college still stood, young Olivia with wild hair and uninhibited smile, capturing who I had been before Bennett and who I had found my way back to, older but more deeply myself. Bennett had been wrong about so many things, but most fundamentally wrong about love. He had conceived of love as a transaction, a performance, a power dynamic to be managed. He had never understood that true love, whether romantic, platonic, or self-directed, begins with acceptance rather than correction, with recognition rather than revision. "No one will ever love you," he had sneered in that moment of cruelty. The joke was indeed on him. I had found not just a soulmate in James, but my own soul, the authentic core of myself that no one else's cruel words could ever diminish again. 2 years after Bennett's cruel words, my life had transformed in ways I once couldn't have imagined. James and I had moved in together, a decision we made after 18 months of dating, when the constant back and forth between our apartments became more inconvenient than charming. We found a 2-bedroom brownstone in Park Slope, with enough space for both of us to have dedicated work areas, a necessity given my writing schedule and his occasional need to bring legal work home. My second novel had been published to even stronger reviews than my debut, establishing me as more than a one-hit wonder in the literary world. James had finally begun the novel he'd been contemplating for years, writing early mornings before heading to his environmental law practice. Our life together felt solid, joyful, and authentically ours, free from the performative elements that had characterized my relationship with Bennett. I rarely thought about Bennett anymore. I would occasionally see his name in Publishers Weekly or hear it mentioned at industry events, but these moments no longer triggered an emotional response. It was as if he'd been recategorized in my mind, from central character to footnote, from defining presence to casual reference, until the email arrived. It came on a Tuesday morning as I was reviewing copy edits for my third novel. A simple subject line, "Congratulations are in order." From Bennett Harrington to Olivia Caldwell. "Olivia, I trust this email finds you well. Your continued success has not gone unnoticed, even as our professional circles have maintained a respectful distance. Your second novel's National Book Award nomination is well-deserved. I'm writing with news of my own that you'll likely hear through industry channels soon enough. I wanted you to hear it directly from me. Adrienne and I are engaged." The wedding is planned for June at her family's estate in Connecticut. I realize this information may seem irrelevant given the time that has passed, but I've always believed in direct communication. There are also practical considerations. We've invited several mutual colleagues, and I wanted to ensure you weren't caught off guard at industry gatherings. On a personal note, I hope you've found the happiness you were seeking. Time and distance provide perspective, and I recognize now that we were perhaps not the match we once believed ourselves to be. Best regards, Bennett. I stared at the screen, aware of the calculated nature of every word. 3 years of being with Bennett had taught me to recognize his particular brand of communication, the careful positioning, the subtle implications, the way he crafted a narrative that invariably served his interests. This email was no different. The congratulations offered first, establishing a tone of professional goodwill. The news of his engagement delivered matter-of-factly, as if it were information I might care about but wouldn't be affected by. The explanation for sharing this news framed as consideration for my comfort, not his need for control of the narrative. And that closing paragraph, the masterpiece of Bennett speak, the happiness you were seeking, implied I had been searching for something our relationship couldn't provide, conveniently overlooking his betrayal. Time and distance provide perspective. Suggested his current view was more objective than mine had been in the aftermath of discovering him with Adrian, and not the match we once believed ourselves to be, rewrote our ending as mutual recognition rather than his infidelity and my departure. 3 years ago, this email would have devastated me. 2 years ago, it would have angered me. Today I felt something unexpected. Amusement. I actually laughed out loud, alone in my home office with sunshine streaming through the windows and the distant sounds of Brooklyn life filtering up from the street below. The sheer predictability of Bennett's need to control this narrative, to ensure I heard about his engagement directly, rather than through colleagues, struck me as almost comically transparent. I closed the email without responding and returned to my copy edits. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. Kim, my agent, who had remained both a professional representative and personal friend through everything. "Have you checked your email this morning?" she asked without preamble. "If you're referring to Bennett's engagement announcement, yes. What are you thinking?" Her tone was careful, neutral. "I'm thinking my copy edits are due tomorrow and I still have 30 pages to review," I replied honestly. Kim was silent for a moment, then laughed. "That's actually the healthiest response possible. But just so you know, he's been telling people you two have reconciled your past and maintain a cordial professional relationship." This was new information and slightly more concerning than the engagement itself. We haven't spoken in over a year, and even then it was just a brief hello at the Penn Awards. "I know that," Kim said. "But Bennett is, well, Bennett, he's rewriting history to match his preferred narrative, which apparently includes you being completely at peace with his marriage to the woman he cheated with." I set down my pen, considering the implications. Does it matter what he says? Most people who know me know the truth. "It matters if you care about industry perception," Kim replied. "But honestly, Olivia, I don't think you need to care. Your work speaks for itself, and your authentic presence at events tells its own story. Anyone who matters can see the difference between the carefully controlled version of you that existed with Bennett and the genuine person you are now." She was right. My success had been built on reclaiming my authentic voice, both on the page and in my professional interactions. Bennett's attempts to craft a revisionist history were ultimately irrelevant to that fundamental truth. Let him tell whatever story makes him feel better, I decided. I'm not going to engage. Good, Kim said, approval evident in her voice. Now finish those copy edits so I can tell your editor to stop panic texting me. After hanging up, I returned to my work, pushing thoughts of Bennett aside until James returned home that evening. We were preparing dinner together, a routine we'd established early in our relationship, finding that collaborative cooking provided a perfect transition between work and relaxation when I mentioned the email. "Bennett's getting married," I said casually, chopping bell peppers for the stir-fry. "To Adrian, the woman I found him with." James looked up from the chicken he was slicing, his expression concerned. "Are you okay?" "Surprisingly, yes," I replied honestly. It struck me as funny, actually, that he felt the need to tell me directly, as if I'd be monitoring industry gossip for updates on his personal life. James studied my face for a moment, then nodded, accepting my assessment of my own feelings, something Bennett had rarely done, typically telling me how I felt rather than asking. "It's interesting timing," he observed. right after your National Book Award nomination was announced. I hadn't made that connection, but James was right. Bennett's email had arrived just days after the long list had been revealed, with my second novel among the 10 selected. You think it's related? I asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. James shrugged, returning to his task. I think people like Bennett are very aware of status and visibility. Your rising profile might make him uncomfortable if the narrative around your breakup doesn't align with how he wants to be perceived. Kim mentioned he's been telling people we've reconciled our past, I said. Which is news to me, considering we've barely exchanged 10 words in the past year. Does that bother you? James asked, his tone free of judgment or insecurity. I considered the question seriously as I added the peppers to the wok, not in the way it once would have. It's irritating that he's misrepresenting our relationship, but it doesn't affect my daily life or my sense of self. James smiled, the expression reaching his eyes in the way I'd come to cherish. That's growth, Olivia Caldwell. Impressive, meaningful growth. We finished cooking together, the conversation shifting to James's day in court and my progress on copy edits. Bennett's engagement became simply one topic among many, not a defining moment or emotional earthquake, exactly as it should be. Later that night, as James slept beside me, I found myself restless, my mind returning to Bennett's email despite my determination to dismiss it. Not because the news itself affected me emotionally, but because something about the timing and phrasing nagged at me in a way I couldn't immediately identify. I slipped out of bed and padded to the kitchen, making a cup of herbal tea and settling at the small table by the window that overlooked the quiet Brooklyn street. The city was never truly silent, but at 2 a.m. it reached a close approximation, just distant sirens and occasional voices floating up from late-night revelers heading home. I reread Bennett's email on my phone, analyzing it more carefully this time. The congratulations on my nomination, the announcement of his engagement, the explanation for sharing this news directly, the carefully worded closing that rewrote our history. Then it clicked. What had been bothering me subconsciously? This email wasn't just an announcement, it was a preemptive move. With my increased visibility from the National Book Award nomination would come more in-depth interviews, more questions about my background, my journey as a writer, my relationships and influences. Bennett was getting ahead of any narrative I might share about our relationship and its ending. By establishing that we had perspective, now, and acknowledging we weren't the match we once believed ourselves to be, he was creating a foundation for dismissing any less flattering account I might offer. It was classic Bennett strategy, controlling the narrative by defining it first, positioning himself as the mature party who had moved beyond past conflicts. He'd done the same thing immediately after our breakup, contacting my agent and professional connections to express concern about my emotional state. The difference was that now I could see the strategy with clear eyes, untangled from the emotional manipulation that had once clouded my perception. And seeing it clearly rendered it largely ineffective. I finished my tea, feeling a renewed sense of peace. Bennett's engagement to Adrienne wasn't about me at all. It was about maintaining his carefully constructed self-image, about ensuring the story told in publishing circles cast him in the best possible light. My emotional response, or lack thereof, was irrelevant to his purposes except as something to be managed or contained. As I returned to bed, slipping quietly under the covers beside James, I realized there was a kind of freedom in this recognition. Bennett no longer occupied emotional space in my life, not as a love, not as a wound, not even as a significant memory. He was simply someone I used to know, whose actions now held minimal power to affect my present happiness. I decided not to respond to his email. No congratulations, no acknowledgement, no engagement with the narrative he was attempting to construct. My silence wasn't wounded or angry. It was simply the natural consequence of having moved on completely. The next morning over breakfast, I shared my middle-of-the-night realization with James. So you think the engagement announcement was strategic? He asked, spreading jam on his toast. I think the decision to email me directly about it was strategic, I clarified. The engagement itself is probably genuine enough. Bennett and Adrienne have always made sense professionally. They operate with similar values and ambitions. James nodded thoughtfully. Are you planning to respond? No, I said, the decision feeling right as I spoke it aloud. There's nothing to say. We're not friends. We're barely even acquaintances at this point. Acknowledging his news would suggest a connection that no longer exists. I'm proud of you, James said simply. Not because ignoring Bennett is inherently better than responding, but because you're making decisions based on what feels authentic to you now, not on old patterns or obligations. This was one of the countless reasons I loved James. His support never felt prescriptive or conditional. He didn't applaud my choices because they aligned with his preferences, but because they represented my authentic self-determination. I leaned across the table and kissed him, morning breath and all. "Thank you for seeing me so clearly." "Easiest thing in the world," he replied with a smile. 2 weeks later, my National Book Award nomination brought a fresh round of media attention. My publicist, Layla, scheduled a series of interviews with literary journals, podcasts, and a few mainstream publications. Unlike the publicity for my first novel, which had been tightly managed with carefully prepared talking points, this cycle embraced a more conversational, authentic approach that allowed my natural voice to emerge. Most interviews focused on the book itself, its themes of reinvention and authenticity, its complex female protagonist who discovers her power through losing everything she thought she wanted. But occasionally, more personal questions arose. During a podcast interview with a well-respected literary critic, the conversation turned to my evolution as a writer. "Your debut was well-received," the host noted, "but many critics have commented on how your voice seems to have strengthened and become more distinctive in this second novel. What changed in your approach or process?" It was a perfect opening to discuss reclaiming my authentic voice after years of subtle suppression, though I could do so without mentioning Bennett specifically. "I underwent a significant personal transformation between the two books," I acknowledged. "My debut was written during a relationship where I'd internalized certain expectations about how I should express myself, both in life and on the page. There was a carefulness to my writing then, a tendency to second-guess my natural instincts." "And now?" the host prompted. "Now I trust the voice that's genuinely mine," I said. "I've learned that the moments I'm most tempted to edit or restrain myself are often the moments with the most potential power. The passages in this new novel that have resonated most strongly with readers are invariably those I wrote with the least self-censorship." "That's fascinating," the host said. "Would you say your personal liberation informed your protagonist's journey in the novel?" "Absolutely," I replied. "Though fiction is never direct autobiography, our emotional truths inevitably shape our characters' experiences." Emma's realization that she's been performing a version of herself to maintain others' approval certainly paralleled my own awakening. The host nodded thoughtfully. "You've been relatively private about your personal life, but there was a period when you were in a relationship with literary agent Bennett Harrington. Did that industry connection influence your early work or career?" The question was direct but not invasive, precisely the kind of professional inquiry I'd anticipated with Bennett's recent reemergence in my sphere. "Any relationship in the publishing world comes with both benefits and complications," I answered carefully. "Bennett introduced me to valuable connections, certainly. But the most significant development in my career came after that relationship ended, when I reconnected with my authentic creative voice." "It's interesting you phrase it that way," the host observed. "The reconnection with authenticity is exactly what your protagonist experiences after her own significant relationship ends." I smiled, neither confirming nor denying the parallel. Writers are always processing their lives through their work, even when they're not aware of it. The interview moved on to other topics, but I was pleased with how I'd navigated that moment, acknowledging the reality of my past with Bennett without letting it become the focus, positioning my growth as a writer as something that flourished after our relationship rather than because of it. When the podcast was released the following week, I received a text from Kim. "Just listened. You handled the B question perfectly. Professional, truthful, but not giving the drama seekers anything juicy. Well done." I appreciated her approval, but more importantly, I felt good about representing my experience honestly while maintaining appropriate boundaries. The Olivia who had been with Bennett would have either avoided the subject entirely or crafted an answer designed to protect his ego and reputation. The Olivia I had become could speak her truth without spite or bitterness, but also without compromising it to maintain someone else's preferred narrative. This balanced approach served me well through the remainder of the publicity cycle. When questions about Bennett arose, which they did with increasing frequency as the award ceremony approached, I maintained the same measured honesty, neither villainizing him nor sanitizing our history. 3 days before the National Book Awards ceremony, I received another email from Bennett. From Bennett Harrington to Olivia Caldwell. Olivia, I've been following your recent interviews with interest. Your book certainly deserves the recognition it's receiving, and you've represented yourself well in the press. I noticed, however, some implications about your creative voice being suppressed during our relationship. While I understand this may be your perception, I hope you recognize that my guidance was always intended to help you succeed in an industry that values certain standards of expression. If asked about our past at the ceremony, which seems increasingly likely given the media's interest, I would appreciate professional courtesy in your responses. We both have reputations to maintain in this relatively small industry. Adrienne sends her congratulations on your nomination as well. Bennett. My immediate reaction was a flash of anger, the presumption that I would speak negatively about him, the implication that my honest reflections on finding my authentic voice were somehow unprofessional, the thinly veiled request to maintain his preferred version of our history. I showed the email to James that evening. He read it carefully, his expression darkening as he reached the end. "Wow," he said finally. "That's something." "It's classic Bennett," I replied, finding my anger already fading into something more like tired recognition. "He's trying to define my experience for me just like he always did." "Are you going to respond?" James asked. I considered the question seriously. "I think I have to." Ignoring the first email made sense. It didn't require a response. But this feels different. Not responding might suggest I agree with his characterization of my interviews, or that I'm willing to let him define the parameters of how I discuss my own life. James nodded. "That makes sense. What do you want to say?" "The truth," I said simply, not to hurt him or expose him, but to establish my boundary clearly. I drafted my response carefully, reading it aloud to James before sending, "From Olivia Caldwell to Bennett Harrington Bennett, thank you for your email. I appreciate your congratulations on my nomination." Regarding my interviews, I've spoken honestly about my journey as a writer, including finding greater creative freedom and authenticity in my work post-relationship. This isn't an attack on you, but a recognition of how I evolved as both a person and writer. I've maintained professional discretion in all my public comments, never naming you specifically or sharing private details of our relationship. I will continue to approach interviews with this same professionalism and authenticity. However, I need to be clear. I won't alter how I discuss my own creative journey to accommodate your preferred narrative. My experiences are mine to interpret and express, just as yours are yours. I wish you and Adrienne happiness in your engagement and future together. Olivia. After sending it, I felt a sense of calm resolution. I hadn't compromised my truth, but I also hadn't engaged in unnecessary conflict or revelation. The boundary was clear. My experiences were mine to define, not his to reshape or contain. Bennett didn't reply, which I took as acknowledgement that further discussion would be unproductive. The boundary had been established. He could choose to respect it or not, but I had made my position clear. The night of the National Book Awards arrived with a flurry of activity. Though I didn't expect to win, I was a relatively new writer up against several established literary figures. The nomination itself was significant career validation. James and I prepared for the evening with a balance of excitement and pragmatism. "Even if you don't win tonight," James said as he adjusted his bow tie, "you've already succeeded beyond what most writers ever achieve. Second novel nominated for one of the most prestigious literary awards in the country. That's extraordinary." I smoothed the fabric of my dress. A vintage 1950s gown in deep emerald that complemented my now fully embraced natural curls. "I know. And honestly, I'm just happy to be there, as cliché as that sounds." "It's not cliché if it's true," James replied, kissing me lightly to avoid disturbing my lipstick. "You ready?" The ceremony was held at Cipriani Wall Street, a cavernous, elegant space with soaring columns and ornate detailing. Literary luminaries mingled with publishers, agents, and cultural figures, creating a buzz of intellectual energy and creative accomplishment. Kim met us at the entrance, resplendent in a tailored black suit. "My star client?" she said, embracing me. "Win or lose, you've made me look very smart for signing you." We laughed, moving into the main hall where cocktails were being served before the ceremony. I spotted several writers I admired, including two of my fellow nominees, and engaged in brief, genuine conversations about their work. James remained by my side, supportive but never overshadowing, another fundamental difference from events I'd attended with Bennett, who had always positioned himself as the industry insider, introducing his promising girlfriend. I was deep in conversation with a literary journal editor when I felt a shift in the energy nearby. Without looking, I knew Bennett had entered our vicinity. That sixth sense developed during years together hadn't completely faded, it seemed. When I finally glanced over, I saw him with Adrienne, working the room with practiced charm. They made an attractive couple, both tall and well-dressed, moving through the crowd with the confidence of industry veterans. I noticed Adrienne's engagement ring catching the light, substantial but tasteful, exactly what I would have expected Bennett to select. James followed my gaze, his hand resting lightly on the small of my back. "You okay?" he asked quietly. "Completely," I assured him and meant it. Seeing Bennett didn't trigger emotional turmoil or even significant discomfort, just a mild awareness, like noticing a former classmate you weren't particularly close to. Eventually, our paths crossed directly, unavoidable in the gradually concentrating crowd as people began moving toward their tables for dinner. Bennett and Adrienne approached, both wearing practiced social smiles. "Olivia," Bennett acknowledged, his tone professionally warm. "Congratulations on your nomination. Very well deserved." "Thank you," I replied simply, then turned slightly to include James. "I don't believe you've met James Sullivan, my partner. James, this is Bennett Harrington and Adrienne Phillips." The men shook hands, assessing each other briefly. James's grip was firm but not aggressive, his smile genuine but reserved. Bennett performed cordiality perfectly, though I could detect the subtle evaluation happening behind his eyes. "I've enjoyed your environmental cases," James said to Bennett, "particularly the Hudson Valley preservation suit last year." "Important work?" It was a generous professional acknowledgement. Bennett's firm had indeed done significant environmental legal work, though Bennett himself wasn't primarily focused in that area. James was extending a branch of collegiality without fawning or posturing. "Thank you," Bennett replied, clearly surprised by this specific knowledge of his firm's cases. "Environmental law is a growing priority for us." An awkward silence threatened to descend until Adrienne spoke. "Your novel is extraordinary, Olivia. The scene where Emma returns to her childhood home, I've never read anything that captured that specific mixture of nostalgia and alienation so perfectly." Her compliment seemed genuine, her expression open. Whatever complications existed in our history, Adrienne appeared to be making a sincere effort to acknowledge my work on its merits. "Thank you," I said, matching her sincerity. "That scene was particularly meaningful to write." Bennett glanced between us, clearly not having anticipated even this small moment of connection. "We should find our table," he said to Adrienne. "The ceremony will be starting soon." They moved away, Bennett's hand on Adrienne's back guiding her through the crowd, a gesture I remembered well from our time together. It had once felt protective, now it seemed faintly controlling. "Well, that wasn't so bad," James commented quietly as we headed toward our own table. "No," I agreed. "Just two literary professionals exchanging pleasantries at an industry event. Nothing more, nothing less." James smiled, understanding the significance of that ordinariness. Progress. The ceremony itself was elegant and efficient. Each category featured brief readings from the nominated works, followed by the announcement of the winner. When my category arrived, I listened to the excerpt from my novel read by a respected actress, hearing my words through someone else's interpretation, always a surreal experience. I didn't win. The award went to an established writer whose powerful novel about immigration and identity had been widely praised as her career masterpiece. I applauded genuinely, admiring her work and understanding that my nomination itself was the significant achievement at this stage in my career. After the ceremony, during the less formal reception that followed, I congratulated the winner and chatted with other nominees, editors, and literary figures. James circulated with me for a while, then got drawn into an interesting conversation with the environmental documentary filmmaker while I spoke with my editor about early ideas for my third book. I was alone momentarily, having stepped away to get a fresh drink, when Bennett approached. He held 2 glasses of champagne, offering one to me in a gesture that felt strangely familiar. He had always managed the drink selection at events during our relationship. "Not your year for the win," he said, "but the nomination puts you in a different category now. You'll see the difference in how you're received." I accepted the champagne but didn't drink immediately, watching him carefully. I'm already seeing it. The conversations tonight have been substantive and forward-looking. Bennett nodded, taking a sip of his own champagne. Your response to my email was noteworthy, very direct. I've found clarity serves everyone better than ambiguity, I replied. A faint smile touched his lips. You have changed, Olivia. There was a time when you would have agonized over every word of that response, worried about how I might receive it. The observation was accurate but unnecessarily pointed, a reminder of power dynamics long dissolved. There was a time when I filtered my reality through your perception, I acknowledged. That time has passed. Bennett studied me for a moment, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Your lawyer seems suitable, different from what I would have expected for you. The comment was classic Bennett, the faint praise of suitable, coupled with the implication that he still knew what was expected. For me, despite years of separation, James is extraordinary, I said simply. And what's right for me isn't something you're positioned to assess anymore, Bennett. He didn't respond immediately, taking another sip of his champagne. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly, becoming more personal. Do you ever think about our time together? We had something significant before. Complications arose. Complications? I repeated, unable to keep a note of incredulity from my voice. Is that how you characterize sleeping with Adrian in our bed? Bennett's expression tightened momentarily before resettling into practiced composure. That was a mistake, one I've acknowledged and learned from. But it doesn't erase 3 years of connection. I felt a sudden clarity. Bennett wasn't seeking reconciliation or even friendship, but validation. Confirmation that our relationship had mattered, that it remained significant in my memory as it apparently did in his. Perhaps his impending marriage to Adrian had triggered reflection or insecurity about his past. Our relationship shaped both of us, I said carefully. But it's in my past now, Bennett. Completely. And yet, he said, his voice taking on an edge I recognized from old arguments, you've referenced it repeatedly in your publicity for this book, the suppression of your voice, the performance you maintained. You've leveraged our history professionally while claiming it's entirely in your past. There it was, the real purpose of this conversation. Not nostalgia or reconciliation, but accusation. An attempt to make me defensive, to regain some measure of control over my narrative. I've spoken about my own experience finding my authentic voice as a writer, I replied evenly. That journey is mine to share. I've never named you or shared private details of our relationship. I set down my untouched champagne on a nearby high-top table. Now, if you'll excuse me, my partner is probably wondering where I am. I started to move past him, but Bennett spoke again, his voice lowered. He won't understand you like I did, Olivia. No one knows you as completely as someone who helped shape you. I stopped, turning back to face him fully. In that moment, I felt neither anger nor hurt, but a profound sense of pity. Bennett genuinely believed that his controlling influence had been beneficial, that his shaping had been an act of care rather than constraint. That's the fundamental difference in how we see our relationship, Bennett, I said quietly. You believe you shaped me? I know now that I contorted myself to fit your expectations. James doesn't try to shape me at all. He simply loves me as I am. Bennett's expression hardened. Very poetic. Perhaps you should save it for your next novel. Perhaps I will. I agreed, refusing to be baited into defensiveness. Good night, Bennett. I wish you and Adrian happiness. I walked away then, making my way back to James, who was still engaged in animated conversation with the documentary filmmaker. He looked up as I approached, his face brightening. Olivia, you have to hear about this project on urban watershed restoration, he said, drawing me into their circle with natural warmth. It connects perfectly with the environmental themes you're considering for your next book. The rest of the evening passed pleasantly, the brief interaction with Bennett fading into insignificance against the backdrop of genuine connections and stimulating conversations. When James and I finally left, stepping into the cool night air and hailing a taxi back to Brooklyn, I felt a deep contentment that had nothing to do with winning or losing literary awards. You seem at peace, James observed as we settled into the back seat of the cab. I am, I confirmed. Bennett approached me while you were talking with the filmmaker. James raised an eyebrow. Anything I should know about? Nothing important, I said truthfully. Just his final attempt to redefine our past relationship on his terms. It didn't work. James took my hand, interlacing our fingers. I'm guessing he didn't appreciate that. No, I laughed softly. He really didn't. His loss, James said simply. In every possible way. I rested my head on his shoulder as the taxi crossed the Brooklyn Bridge, the Manhattan skyline glittering behind us. I had a thought tonight, watching all those incredible writers being recognized for their work. What's that? If Bennett hadn't said those words to me, "No one will ever love you," I might never have found the strength to leave. As cruel as they were, they became the catalyst for everything good in my life now. My authentic writing voice, my genuine friendships, finding you, all of it came after that moment of clarity. James was quiet for a moment, considering this. The universe works in strange ways sometimes. But I'd argue that strength was always in you. His cruelty just gave you the opportunity to recognize it. Maybe, I acknowledged. Either way, I'm grateful for where I am now. Who I am now. Me too, James said, kissing the top of my head. Though for the record, I'd have fallen in love with you in any version. Even the one who second-guessed her sentences and laughed more quietly than she wanted to. You never met that version of me, I reminded him. No, he agreed. But I see glimpses of her sometimes, when you're tired or stressed or caught off guard. The difference is that now she's just one facet of you, not the whole performance. His observation was astute, as always. The Olivia who had adapted to Bennett's preferences hadn't disappeared entirely. She was a learned response, a protective mechanism that occasionally resurfaced in moments of insecurity. The difference was that now I recognized her when she appeared, understood her origins, and could consciously choose whether to let her lead or to set her gently aside. I love you, I said simply. I love you too, he replied. Every authentic, occasionally chaotic, brilliantly creative bit of you. The taxi turned onto our street, and as we approached our brownstone, I felt the rightness of this life I'd built, a life defined not by someone else's expectations, but by my own choices, values, and authentic expression. 6 months later, on a warm June weekend, I was writing on our rooftop garden when James appeared with 2 glasses of iced tea and a slightly nervous expression. Taking a break? I asked, saving my document and closing my laptop. We had established a comfortable rhythm to our work patterns, respecting each other's focus time, but also recognizing when connection was needed. Sort of, he said, sitting beside me on the cushioned bench we'd positioned to catch the morning sun. I actually wanted to talk to you about something. His tone was serious but not somber, stirring my curiosity rather than concern. That sounds ominous, I teased. James smiled, taking my hand. Not ominous. At least I hope not. He took a deep breath. Today is Bennett and Adrian's wedding. I blinked in surprise. I'd completely forgotten the June timeline Bennett had mentioned in his original email about the engagement. Okay, I said slowly. That's not really relevant to us, is it? No, James agreed. And yes, it got me thinking about timing and significance and all the strange ways lives intersect. He shifted slightly to face me more directly. Olivia, we've never really talked about marriage. It hasn't seemed necessary. We're happy, committed, building a life together. But I realized recently that I don't want to assume we're on the same page without actually checking. My heart quickened. What page are we discussing exactly? James smiled, a hint of nervousness still visible in his eyes. The marriage page. The do you ever see yourself wanting that page? Are you proposing? I asked, genuinely uncertain where this conversation was heading. No, he said quickly. Or not exactly. I'm proposing a conversation about whether proposals are something you're open to. Because of your history, because of how Bennett weaponized the concept with that ring. I didn't want to surprise you with something that might carry complicated associations. The thoughtfulness of this approach, considering my past experiences and potential triggers before making assumptions, was so characteristically James that I felt a rush of emotion. I've never been opposed to marriage itself, I said carefully. What I rejected with Bennett was a relationship built on performance and control, not the concept of commitment. James nodded, his expression attentive. That makes sense. But there's a difference between not being opposed to something and actively wanting it. I considered his words, appreciating the space he was creating for genuine reflection rather than a pressured response. With you, I said finally, I can imagine marriage being beautiful. Not as a social achievement or professional alliance, but as a simple, meaningful commitment between two people who love each other authentically. His smile broadened, relief and happiness evident. That's how I see it too. Are you planning to propose formally at some point? I asked, curious now about his intentions. I'd like to, he admitted. Not with grand gestures or public displays. That doesn't feel like us. But with intention and meaning when the moment feels right. I squeezed his hand, a sense of peaceful certainty settling over me. I'd like that too. And just so you know, when you do, my answer will be yes. James laughed, the sound full of joy and relief. That's good to know. Takes some of the pressure off. We sat together on the rooftop, talking about what marriage might mean for us, practically, emotionally, legally, and what kind of ceremony would feel authentic if we decided to have one. The conversation wasn't fraught with anxiety or expectations, just honest exploration of how this traditional institution might be shaped to reflect our particular values and relationship. As we talked, I found myself reflecting on the stark contrast between this open discussion and the way Bennett had approached the concept of marriage, purchasing a ring without consultation, hiding it as a manipulation tool, using it after our breakup to suggest I'd discarded something precious. You know what I appreciate most about this conversation? I said to James as the afternoon sun began to shift toward evening. It's collaborative rather than prescriptive. We're designing a potential future together, not one person planning something for the other to fit into. James nodded, understanding immediately. That's the only kind of relationship that makes sense to me. Equal voices, shared creation. In that moment, with Brooklyn spread around us and the man I loved beside me, Bennett and Adrian's wedding day, happening somewhere in Connecticut with undoubtedly perfect floral arrangements and impeccably dressed guests, seemed entirely irrelevant to my life. Not because I harbored lingering resentment or wished them ill, but because our paths had so completely diverged that their significant moments no longer registered as even minor notes in my own story. 3 weeks later, James proposed. It wasn't elaborate or theatrical, just the two of us hiking in the Catskills, reaching a stunning overlook after a challenging climb. He didn't kneel or present a ring box, simply took both my hands and asked if I would marry him, his voice steady but thick with emotion. Yes, I said immediately, the certainty I'd felt on our rooftop only strengthened by the intervening weeks. Absolutely yes. He pulled a small pouch from his pocket then, tipping a ring into his palm. It wasn't a traditional engagement diamond, but an antique emerald surrounded by tiny seed pearls, set in warmly glowing gold rather than platinum. It reminded me of your eyes, he said as he slipped it onto my finger. And it has history. It's from the 1920s. I liked the idea of continuing its story with ours. The thoughtfulness of the choice, so perfectly aligned with my aesthetic and values, brought tears to my eyes. This ring wasn't a status symbol or a mark of ownership, but a meaningful token chosen with intimate knowledge of who I truly was. We didn't immediately announce our engagement, taking a few weeks to savor it privately before sharing the news with close friends and family. When we did begin telling people, the response was uniformly joyful, genuine celebration of a union that made sense to anyone who had seen us together. Kim was particularly delighted. "I've been waiting for this," she said when I called to tell her. "Not because every woman needs to get married, but because you two have something real and beautiful. I'm so happy for you, Olivia." "Thank you," I said, touched by her enthusiasm. "We're thinking a small ceremony next spring, nothing elaborate." "Perfect," she approved, and completely unlike what certain other literary couples might plan. I laughed, knowing she was referring to Bennett and Adrienne, whose wedding had apparently been covered in the society pages, complete with professional photographs of their literary royalty celebration. "Speaking of industry news," Kim continued, her tone shifting slightly, "I should mention that Bennett has been telling people you reached out to congratulate him on his marriage." I sighed, unsurprised but still disappointed. "Of course he has. Despite the fact that I did no such thing." "I figured as much," Kim replied. "It's his usual approach, creating the narrative he prefers regardless of reality." "Do you want me to correct it when it comes up?" I considered the question seriously. "No," I decided after a moment. "Let him tell whatever story makes him feel better about our history. My energy is better spent on my actual life than on managing his fictional version of it. That," Kim said approvingly, "is the perspective of someone who has truly moved on." The months that followed were filled with the happy business of planning a small spring wedding while continuing our professional lives. My third novel was in the final editing stages. James was working on an important environmental case, and we were exploring the possibility of buying an apartment rather than continuing to rent. Life was full, meaningful, and authentically ours. shaped by mutual decisions and shared values, rather than one person's vision imposed on the other. The ghost of Bennett's influence had faded almost completely from my daily consciousness, emerging only occasionally in dreams or triggered by specific situations. One such situation arose in December, when my publisher scheduled a major event at a prestigious Manhattan venue to launch the upcoming spring catalog, featuring my third novel as one of their lead titles. It would be my first significant industry appearance since the National Book Awards ceremony, and my publicist warned me that Bennett and Adrian would likely attend, given their connections to several authors on the list. "We can request they be seated far from you," Layla offered. "Just say the word." "That's not necessary," I assured her. "We've established a professionally cordial dynamic. I don't anticipate any issues." What I didn't mention was that this event would be the first time James and I would appear publicly as an engaged couple in the publishing world. Our families and friends knew, but we hadn't made any social media announcements or industry declarations. My emerald ring would make the statement for us. The night of the event, James and I dressed with slightly more care than usual, me in a vintage-inspired crimson dress that complemented my now fully embraced natural curls, him in a charcoal suit that highlighted his athletic build. The emerald ring caught the light as I applied a final touch of lipstick. "Ready to make our debut as the future Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan?" James asked, straightening his tie in the mirror beside me. "Actually," I said, turning to face him, "I've been meaning to talk to you about that. I'm thinking of keeping my name professionally. I've built my career as Olivia Caldwell, but personally I like the idea of being Olivia Sullivan. How would you feel about that arrangement?" James considered this for only a moment before nodding. "That makes perfect sense to me. Your name is part of your professional identity. And honestly, I like the idea that the world gets Olivia Caldwell, but I get to be married to Olivia Sullivan, like a special version just for home." His understanding, immediate and unburdened by ego or traditional expectations, was yet another reminder of how different this relationship was from what I'd experienced with Bennett, who had once commented that if we married, having the same last name would strengthen our brand within the industry. The publishing event was held at a renovated industrial space in Chelsea, transformed for the evening with strategic lighting, abundant flowers, and multiple bars serving craft cocktails. Authors, editors, agents, and industry media mingled beneath exposed beams and Edison bulbs, the conversations creating a constant buzz of intellectual energy. James and I arrived fashionably on time, immediately greeted by my editor Meredith and several executives from the publishing house. I introduced James to those who hadn't yet met him, his hand warm and steady against the small of my back as we navigated the increasingly crowded space. It didn't take long for someone to notice my ring. An editor from another imprint glanced down during our conversation, her eyes widening slightly before her face broke into a genuine smile. "Olivia, is that an engagement ring?" "It's stunning." The question drew attention from those nearby, creating a small ripple of interest. I smiled, neither hiding nor overly emphasizing the news. "Yes, James and I are getting married in the spring." Congratulations flowed naturally, glasses were raised, and the news began its subtle journey through the room, not as a formal announcement, but as a happy detail shared among colleagues and acquaintances. I was deep in conversation with a bookseller from Portland when I felt that familiar shift in energy that signaled Bennett's arrival. Looking up, I saw him and Adrian entering, both impeccably dressed and moving with the confident ease of people accustomed to being noticed. James, engaged in a separate conversation nearby, caught my eye briefly across the room, a silent check-in that I answered with a small, reassuring smile. We had discussed the likelihood of encountering Bennett and Adrian, agreeing that we would be cordial but not go out of our way to engage beyond professional necessity. As the evening progressed, our paths inevitably crossed. Bennett and Adrian approached during a moment when James and I were speaking with my publisher about the upcoming publicity schedule for my new novel. "Olivia," Bennett acknowledged, his gaze briefly assessing James before returning to me. "Congratulations on the new book." The advance excerpt in The New Yorker was impressive. "Thank you," I replied simply. "Bennett, Adrian, you remember James Sullivan?" Greetings were exchanged, the superficial pleasantries of industry colleagues with limited personal connection. Adrian seemed genuinely warm, complimenting the excerpt and asking about themes in the new novel. Bennett maintained perfect professional cordiality, though I could sense him taking in details. The way James and I stood comfortably close, the natural rhythm of our interaction, the emerald ring now clearly visible on my left hand. "It appears congratulations are in order for more than just the book," Bennett observed, his gaze flickering to my hand. "Recently engaged?" "Yes," James answered before I could, his tone warm but not over-solicitous. "I'm a very fortunate man." Bennett's expression remained pleasant, though something flashed briefly in his eyes. Not jealousy exactly, but perhaps a more complicated emotion, a recognition of finality. "Well, best wishes to you both." "Thank you," I said. "How is married life treating you?" It was a cordial question, the kind one asks of recent newlyweds regardless of relationship complexity. Adrienne smiled, her expression softening. "It's wonderful. We're settling into a new apartment on the Upper West Side, with a home office for each of us," Bennett added. "Essential for two people in publishing." The conversation continued for another minute or two, professional details, impersonal updates, nothing of substance or emotional significance. Then they moved on to greet other colleagues, and the moment passed as smoothly as I could have hoped. Later, as James and I shared a quiet drink in a corner of the venue, he asked, "How was that for you? Seeing them together as a married couple? Having them see us engaged?" I considered the question seriously. "It felt insignificant," I said finally. "Not in a dismissive way, but in the sense that their marriage has no impact on my life or happiness. And our engagement isn't in response to or competition with theirs. They're just people we know professionally now." James nodded, understanding. "That's healthy. Neither lingering attachment nor lingering resentment." "Exactly," I agreed. "Bennett is just someone I used to know intimately, who is now a distant professional acquaintance. The emotional connection, both positive and negative, has dissolved." "That's the true opposite of love," James observed. "Not hate, but indifference." As we prepared to leave the event, I noticed Bennett watching us from across the room, his expression unreadable. Our eyes met briefly, and in that moment I felt a curious sense of completion, as if a story that had been left with loose ends had finally reached its proper conclusion. Not through dramatic confrontation or emotional catharsis, but through the simple reality of two lives that had once been intertwined, now operating on completely separate trajectories, touching only at the most superficial points of professional intersection. Outside, as we waited for our car service, the December air was crisp and invigorating. James wrapped his arm around me, pulling me close against the cold. "Happy?" he asked simply. "Completely," I answered, leaning into his warmth. "You know what I realized tonight?" Bennett's cruel words, "No one will ever love you. They've lost all power." Not just because they've been proven wrong, but because I finally understand they were never about me at all. James looked down at me, curious. "What do you mean?" "They were a projection of his own fear," I explained. "Bennett doesn't know how to love authentically, only how to shape someone into what he wants and then appreciate his own creation. When I stopped conforming to his vision, he couldn't see anything lovable because he never saw the real me to begin with." James considered this, then nodded slowly. "That makes sense." His words reflected his limitations, not your lovability. "Exactly," I said as our car pulled up to the curb. And the beautiful irony is that by saying those words, he set me free to find someone who could love the authentic me, messy, passionate, occasionally chaotic, and completely real. James opened the car door, then paused to kiss me, a soft, tender kiss that held the promise of our future together. "I wouldn't have you any other way." As we drove home through the glittering Manhattan night, I thought about the strange, winding path that had brought me here, from the eager young editorial assistant who had fallen for Bennett's charm to the confident writer and woman I had become. The journey hadn't been easy, but every step, even the painful ones, had been necessary to reach this place of authentic happiness. Bennett had been wrong about so many things, but most catastrophically wrong about love. Love wasn't about shaping someone to fit your vision or controlling their expression to match your preferences. True love was what James offered, space to be fully myself, support without direction, appreciation without condition. "No one will ever love you," Bennett had sneered in that moment of cruelty. But someone did love me. Someone who had never tried to reshape me or quiet me or make me smaller to fit his needs. Someone who celebrated my authenticity rather than managing it. Someone who saw me clearly and loved precisely what he saw. The joke indeed was on Bennett. In trying to wound me with his cruelest prediction, he had inadvertently set in motion the journey that would lead me to my greatest joy, a life lived authentically, a love based on truth, a future built on mutual respect and genuine understanding. And that perhaps was the most satisfying revenge of all.